One of the largest expenses that most people have actually sits in plain sight, and no, it is not your coffee habit every single day.
This was supposed to be hot.
Oh my God.
So in this video, we're gonna discuss exactly what that largest expense is, as well as how you can save thousands of dollars per year by understanding the components of this cost, and how you can actually make money with all of those savings that you have. So first, we gotta understand that most households have the same major categories of expenses, and that's gonna be housing, transportation, taxes, utilities, and household costs, which I think I'm just gonna lump that in with housing, and then food, etc. So if we can save big on these categories, we're gonna save a lot of money. Now, can you guess here what the #1 wealth killer is? Hint, it's gonna be the cost that actually varies the most from person to person here, and that's why it sits in plain sight. It's actually transportation. So cars are a huge wealth killer, and the reason is that a lot of our society attributes success to having a really nice car or a nice ride, and I think a lot of people buy nicer of a car than they can actually afford because of status. I was having a conversation with Nate O'Brien last week. He's also a financial YouTuber and the inspiration for this video, and one of the things that we both agreed on was that cars are taking away significantly from that. People seem to give each other props whenever they get a new car.
Hey, excuse me, man. Excuse me. Your car's awesome. What do you do for a living?
My wife's rich.
And it's always so nice to see your friends, driving around in a nice ride. However, we're not really too aware of the financial impacts that it actually brings about because it's sitting right under our noses and everyone does the same thing. But in 2023, used car prices are up again. So they're up 2.5% in January month over month, and 15.7% of people who financed a new car in Q4 of 2022 committed to a monthly payment of more than $1,000 a month, which is the highest it's ever been. Now, crazily enough, in addition to that, we're still seeing crazy dealer markups on many cars that are in demand. So look at this Porsche right here. It has a $250,000 markup, which is absolutely insane. The markup is basically almost the price of the car itself. Lastly, the average cost of ownership to operate and own a car, according to AAA in 2022, is $10,728 per year. So let that sink in a little bit. That's a lot of money. So let's actually outline some of these expenses of owning a car, and I'm gonna tell you about how I would try to save money in every single one of these categories. All right, so I've pulled up this 2018 Honda Civic here, and as you can see, the true cost to own over 5 years is $43,993, which is just shy of $8,800 a year. Now, I purposely chose a Honda Civic. It's a pretty economic car. It's not crazy expensive. It's also 5 years old. It's not like it's some crazy flashy BMW that every person in their 20s really covets and really wants. All right, we can see that it's still quite pricey to even own this economical car. I mean, the average American salary is roughly $54K a year. So imagine owning a used car, and then that cost of ownership every single year is taking up 16% of your gross salary. It's gonna be really hard to build wealth and compound our savings if we're continually living outside of our means, especially when it comes to car ownership. Now, I'm not saying that having a Honda Civic should be considered as living outside of your means. In fact, I think a Honda Civic is a pretty reasonable car, but I do want to draw attention to the fact that it could be costing you a lot more money than you might think. All right, so let's actually break down the costs here. The biggest expense on this Honda Civic is depreciation. So 99% of cars will depreciate, or basically have a reduction in their asset value as wear and tear and time goes on. So car depreciation is one of the biggest reasons why I think investing your money in a car is a really bad idea, because as soon as you invest that money into a car, the depreciating asset, the value of that car goes down. So essentially you are putting your money in something that is bound to go down. If you want to save money on this category, I would suggest not buying a new car. So infamously, if you've ever heard this, whenever you buy a new car and you drive it off of the lot, it then becomes a used car, and immediately 10 to 15% of that car's value is taken off due to depreciation. If you look at car depreciation curves, I'll bring one up on the screen right now. Different cars are going to have different curves, but the sweet spot to buy a car is somewhere in the 3 to 5 year used range. This is when most of the depreciation has been chipped off already, but the car is still basically new enough so that it's not going to run into a lot of problems with maintenance and repairs. So I think when it comes to cars, if you want to save a lot of money on depreciation, you want to buy a car that's used, about 3 to 4 years old, and maybe has between 30 and 40,000 miles. I'm always looking at that for a sweet spot, and basically if you can get one of those cars, you're going to save a lot of money on depreciation. All right, real quick, before we move into the next category, I wanted to tell you about my free newsletter. It's called Hump Days. It'll be linked down below, but it's a free publication that comes out twice a week covering business and the economy. We put a lot of time and effort into it every single week, so if you enjoy our content here on video, you'll also probably enjoy that. I will link it down below. All right, the next biggest category on this Honda Civic here is taxes and fees. Now, you're really not gonna get around this one. Generally, every car that you get is going to have some sort of taxes and registration fees every single year. If you're a family with multiple cars, one way to reduce this cost is to just reduce the number of cars that you own. That's a lot easier said than done, but I know some families that have 3 or 4 cars and there are only 2 or 3 people in that own household. That could save you a bunch of money here because let's say you had 1 more extra car than you actually need. That's costing you fees every single year in registration, as well as in California, where I'm from, you have to pass a smog check pretty regularly, which can also add up. But in general, you can't really avoid taxes and fees, so it's pretty hard to save money here. The next sliver here is financing. So when it comes to financing, these are in reference to interest payments, especially when you go and finance a car. Not many people will buy a car up front with all the cash that they have. Not many people have $30,000, $40,000, or $50,000 to drop in a car. So what actually ends up happening is someone will put up $5,000 or maybe $7,000 down on a car and then finance the rest with interest as well as the loan. Interest fees are going to be super high these days because the interest rates keep on climbing and climbing. So right now, I believe if you have good credit, the interest rate on a car is between 6 and 6.5%. Now, if you have bad credit, that interest rate is going to be even higher. And at that point, I probably would suggest you not to even try to buy or finance a new car. Perhaps go for something a little bit used or a little bit older. Regardless, if you finance, lease, or you own the car outright, the next biggest category here is fuel. Now, this is something that people always don't really factor in when it comes to their monthly payment. They might say to themselves, yeah, my monthly payment is $500 or $600 a month, but they're forgetting that gas costs them $200 a month every month. So if we look at the cost of fuel just for the Honda Civic here, it's $12,807 over 5 years. That's an extra $2,561 per year, or about $200 a month. That's assuming you drive it 15,000 miles a year. And that can really add up. I mean, there's not really that much you can do when it comes to saving money on gas. You could get a Costco membership and always fill up at Costco. It is a lot cheaper to fill up there. So you could save between $5 and $8 every time you fill up. And that could add up over time if every single time you fill up your car, you go to Costco. You could also buy an electric car, but that's not always feasible. And honestly, electric cars are really expensive these days. So, I mean, hopefully in 10 to 20 years, everything is going to be moving towards electric and more fuel efficiency. However, right now, I don't really see us like just stepping away from fossil fuels anytime in the next 5 years. So assuming you have a car right now, you are probably going to be spending money on fuel for at least the next 5 years. And honestly, I think gas prices are just going to continue to go up over time. Insurance for this Honda Civic is $6,949 for 5 years, or about $115 extra per month. A good tip I got from Nate O'Brien when we were talking about cars was that every single year he marks down a certain date on the calendar, and right on that date he calls his insurance company and sees if he can get a better rate on his insurance. And if he can't do that, then he's going to shop around for different rates at different insurance providers. The thing with car insurance is that many places will offer you similar or even equal insurance to your current provider, and every insurance company knows that if they get you as a long-term customer, that you're worth a lot to them over time. So what you can do once a year is, let's say you have AAA insurance, you can use that AAA insurance policy that you have, call around to different places. Call State Farm, call Progressive, call Geico. See if you can get a better rate for your exact same coverage. Oftentimes, these companies are going to try to undercut each other, and often you will get a better deal, saving you a lot of money in the short and the long run. Now, this is personally something I even do with utility bills, like for example, my cell phone plan or an internet bill. So for example, with Comcast, I have it marked on my calendar every single year to call them and just get their introductory rate again. So every single, I mean, I've done this for 4 straight years now, but around, Christmas time, I usually call Comcast. I'm like, hey, things are getting a little bit tight on the budget, and I might consider switching to a different internet service provider if you're not able to honor the introductory offer. You'll usually be connected to their retention department, in which case they will usually extend the offer for you for another year or 2. And I've basically done this every single year. So if you are watching and you're from Comcast, I never did that. However, if you're not from Comcast, this is something you can do. You can call utility bills like that and see if they'll offer you a promotional rate moving forward. All right, so repairs and maintenance are the final two parts of this sliver here, and these are hard costs to really reduce unless you know what you're doing around a car. With YouTube tutorials these days, you can actually learn how to do basic maintenance on your car if you're willing to learn and put in the time and the effort. For example, changing your oil is not super difficult. You could watch this 20-minute tutorial, for example, from Chris Fix, and you could learn how to change your oil, and then every subsequent time you change your oil, you're probably gonna save between $100, $125, and $150 on labor. If you think about how many times you'll have to change your oil in your lifetime, that means watching that 20-minute YouTube video on how to do it is gonna save you a bunch of money in the long run. Cars are supposed to get their oil changed every, 3,000 miles? So let's say you drive 15,000 miles a year, that's 5 oil changes per year. Now imagine you're the age of 30 right now and you wanna drive until you're the age of 75, let's just pretend. 75, that's the hard stop. That's 45 years of oil changes, or about 225 oil changes. For simplicity's sake, let's say you only do 200 oil changes over your lifetime, not 225, because you miss things, and maybe you want to go to Disneyland and just totally forget, I don't know, whatever you want to do. Anyway, let's just call it 200 even. 200 oil changes times $100 in savings every single time. That's $20,000 over the course of your life that you could be saving if you just watched a 20-minute YouTube tutorial and then just change the oil yourself every single time. I think that might be well worth it. That depends on you if you like to, work on your car or not, but that's pretty interesting. Another thing that you can do is that whenever your check engine light comes on, you can go to a place like AutoZone and they have a free diagnostic tool. And so you just go there, they tell you what's wrong with your car, and then you can decide what you want to do with it. So what they're actually doing is running an OBD2 scanner into your car and then telling you what's wrong with the car so that you're not running to the dealership every single time that your check engine light comes on. And you can actually buy one of these scanners yourself online. Once you figure out the problem, you can then assess what you actually want to do. So here's a little bit of a personal story. My mom, who's in her 70s, bless her heart, she had the check engine light on her car go off. She could not figure out what it was, and she was afraid to drive on it, so she made an appointment to get it serviced in about a week. And so what actually ended up happening was she barely drove on it for that week. She just kind of stayed at home, wasn't very mobile. And then when she got to the dealership, she just found out that the check engine light was basically signaling that the gas cap was not screwed on very properly. So she wasted her time in going to the dealership, and had she had just known it was a gas cap, I'm sure she would have just kind of finagled around with it until the check engine light went off. So sometimes the check engine light is a really benign problem, and that's something that's good to know. All right, so my last tip here is that if you can go without a car, that actually might be the best ultimate solution that you can have. So let's pretend you don't have a car, and let's say you save $10,768, or the average cost per year of ownership, and instead you take that money and you go invest it in yourself, or you invest it in the stock market. So what if you took $10,000 in 2018 and you put it, let's say, in Microsoft stock? Well, Microsoft stock has done really well for the past 5 years, and it's almost tripled in that time. That means your $10,000 investment would be worth closer to $30,000, and who knows what it would be worth in another 5 or 10 years. Now that's just one example here, obviously, and obviously I chose a really good example where your money triples. You could also lose your money, but the idea here is that the opportunity cost is so great because not only are you paying $10,000 for the cost of ownership of the car, that means you're not having that $10,000 work for you elsewhere. Another thing that you can consider is just living closer to where you work. So a lot of people, they commute to work in their cars, and that creates a lot of wear and tear, depreciation, fuel costs, etc. Now, if you had the option to live closer to where you work, but the rent was a little bit higher, let's say it was $200 more per month, you actually have to do the work and figure out, is that worth it to you in dollars and your time? It definitely could be worth it. You could be paying $200 more per month for a place that's closer to your work, but now you don't have to drive as much, saving you fuel, depreciation, maintenance, wear and tear, all that good stuff. It could actually amount to a lot more of savings. I mean, you probably know someone that has a crazy commute. I remember I used to work in corporate culture, and people would drive 45 minutes regularly, or even an hour just to get to work. These costs add up, so really consider where you live and where your workplace is, and when you are applying for a new job, that's something you can consider as well. So with car prices still going up and trying to keep up with the Joneses these days, try not to succumb to owning a car that you can't really afford. So it's no surprise that because I got my start on social media on TikTok, that I have a lot of young viewers that are always wondering, what should you be buying or doing in your 20s versus what should you not be doing in your 20s? And I was just thinking about all the decisions that I've made in my life revolving around money, and specifically in my 20s, there are definitely some purchases that I've made that are just the dumbest purchases I've ever done, and I definitely regret them. So even though I'm really careful with my money, I've still made some really dumb money decisions in my life, and so I wanted to make this video about the 5 dumbest purchases that I've made in my 20s and exactly how they happened. Each of these purchases has a lesson that you can take away from it, and so if you learn from my mistakes, my hope is that it saves you some money in the long run. Starting with the number 1 dumbest purchase that I made in my 20s, I spent $5,500 on developing a slots casino app for the App Store. I really wish that I didn't do this, but in late 2016, early 2017, when I was starting my entrepreneurial journey after quitting my job, I thought it would be a good idea to try to start a new app in the gaming space. I talked to one of my mentors at the time, his name was Michael, and he actually had just left his job in the gaming space as well, so we actually got together and we were like, okay, why don't we just make a really simple game, launch it on the iOS store, and then therefore we can be rich. We thought it would be easy because slots are relatively straightforward games. You input the odds, you design the game, and then you launch it on the iOS store. What more could go wrong? After talking to a few developers on Upwork, we actually stumbled across a talented developer by the name of Columbo, and I don't really know if that was his real name or not because it sounds kind of like a fake name, but either way, his name was Columbo, and we decided on the specs with him, and he assured us that he can get us onto the App Store by the end of this whole process. We figured as long as we could get it on the App Store, we could probably make our money back and then some. So it sounds like a really easy proposition. You design a game, you get some developer to make it for you, and then you profit, right? Wrong. What I learned was that it was insanely difficult to even get through the design phase of designing one of these games. Now, to give you some context, I had been working in the video game industry for at least 3 to 4 years professionally, and in addition to that, I had played video games my entire life, even competitively for some of those games. I thought I had a pretty good understanding of how a slot machine worked. I read a lot of theory about them, and I actually understood how the expected value mechanism worked for a slot machine. Did I know how to develop or actually design a game? Absolutely not. But however, I did have Michael, and Michael had worked in the gaming industry for longer than I had, so I figured between the two of us, we could probably figure this out. The design phase ended up being a long and tedious process. I would say it probably took us 4 to 6 months of back and forth with Columbo to get to the place where the game would actually work when we actually pressed the spin button. There were always multiple issues with the game itself. Sometimes buttons didn't work, sometimes the spin mechanism wouldn't work, and sometimes the rewards would just end up in an error screen. The developer always assured us that this was a normal part of the process and that he would fix things as soon as he could, but oftentimes those fixes would take days or even weeks for a seemingly simple task. It was a constant struggle talking to him because English wasn't his first language and he was in a different time zone entirely, so oftentimes our process would take a lot longer. When we were finally ready to move on to the next steps of our development process and try to get it ready for the iOS store, Columbo said that that was beyond his scope. We would actually have to work with his friend named Jason in order to get the game launched on the iOS store, and that kind of came as a surprise to us because he had assured us from the get-go that he could get us onto the iOS store. This is where it got a little bit weird and confusing for me, but since Michael and I had already both sunk $4,500 each into this project, we kind of had this sunk cost fallacy and we were like, okay, we might as well go with Jason because that's our best bet. At this point, we're about half a year into this project. We have nothing to show for it other than a rudimentary app that we think we're going to be able to get on the App Store, and now we have to switch developers to this guy named Jason, and guess what? Jason was a scammer. After about 2 weeks, he just completely ghosted us, and so we actually reached out to Upwork support and the fraud team, and boy, we were correct. Apparently, they found evidence that our freelancer, Jason, was previously removed from the platform for misrepresentation and non-delivery of work, and not only that, he took our $2,000 deposit for the next steps of this project and basically ran. The worst part was that Upwork didn't really help us at all, and we had a really hard time getting our money back. So after all is said and done, we spent $5,500 each on this project, not including the business formation fees, etc. And basically we had nothing to show for it. And the funny thing is though, I do think that this was like kind of like a blessing in disguise, because if the game had made it onto the iOS store, I believe that we would have still had way more problems that would have required more money to fix. The lesson I learned here was that if you're going to take on a new endeavor like this, try to go with vetted referrals, especially when it comes to development, and really make sure that you're going to be committed to this game or this app or or whatever you're trying to make if you really want to do it. If you feel like someone is not being forthright or you feel like something is off, always trust your intuition and always ask a bunch of questions. I had weird vibes working with Columbo that entire time, but when he asked us to work with his friend Jason, that's when I should have known. It doesn't matter, at the end of the day, Michael ended up getting another job, so we probably wouldn't have worked on that project too seriously anyways, but still, that was a really big learning lesson. Now, my next dumb purchase in my 20s wasn't a single item, but it's actually a whole category of items in which I would spend money on hobbies that I would get excited about, but I wasn't actually fully committed to. Like, I would see something on TV and get infatuated with the idea of becoming a chef, a private pilot, or just even a photographer. Then I would go out and buy some sort of item related to that hobby because I thought that would spark some inspiration within me, and then that financial burden that I had taken by buying that item would make me want to do that hobby. For example, I bought a $250 clarinet. It arrived at my house and I promptly did not touch it for about 3 years. I never even took it out of the packaging, and after about 3 years, I think I just sold it on Facebook Marketplace for like $80, and so I took the L on that. When it came to being a chef, I bought a Japanese chef's knife as well as a few fancy cookbooks, and guess what, guys? I still don't cook to this day, so you can say that probably failed as well. When it came to photography, I bought an $800 Sony camera. At least I bought it secondhand and didn't pay the full retail price, but it was still $800. I took a few photos one day out in the park on a nice afternoon, and that was the end of that. For the remainder of the years, it just kind of sat in my closet collecting dust. However, eventually, when I started making videos online for YouTube, I actually did use that camera a little bit, so it wasn't all for nothing. And the private pilot stuff, well, in order to get my pilot's license, I had to buy about $250 worth of educational materials that arrived at my house. I read about 5 pages of the first manual, and then I gave up promptly. The moral of the story, or the takeaway here, is that whenever I'm starting a new hobby, I really want to validate and make sure that I'm really into that hobby before buying anything. So I'm going to try to delay any purchases regarding to a hobby until I know that I'm fully in it. If I've spent less than 5 hours doing a hobby, or perhaps if you spent less than 5 hours doing a hobby, it's probably not a good idea to go buy a whole suite of things to accompany that hobby until you really know that you're invested. It's kind of similar to why so many people go and get a gym membership without ever having the habit of lifting weights or going to the gym. It doesn't really make sense because if you sign up for that gym membership, you're going to be in a year-long contract, you're going to spend all this money, and you might not even end up going. In fact, most gyms kind of just rely on that habit to make them money, and so they know that, you should now know that, and so you should know to avoid that. For me, I realized that a financial burden or a sunk cost isn't going to motivate me to do the thing, and so I don't know if that's going to be the same for you, but I would argue that for most people, just because you've spent money on something, it won't intrinsically motivate you to do that hobby. So if you're getting into something new, try to think critically about whether or not you actually want to do that new thing for a while before you spend money on it. The third dumbest purchase I made in my 20s was actually spending money on instructional poker courses or instructional poker materials. For example, I spent $2,500 on a poker book one time. Now, how did I even get to a point where I was spending close to a month's salary on just a book that would teach you how to play poker? Well, that's a pretty good story in and of itself. Back in my early 20s and my mid 20s, I was an online poker player and I liked to play poker recreationally. I would say my entire generation was actually influenced by the Moneymaker effect, and that's actually the name of a poker player by the name of Chris Moneymaker. Yes, that's his real name. But in 2003, he won the main event of the World Series of Poker in Texas Hold'em. He was just a normal accountant from Tennessee or something, and the way that he actually got into the main event was that he won a qualifier on a poker website. So that inspired a whole bunch of new poker players, including myself, and throughout college, I would deposit money on various poker websites while it was still somewhat legal in the United States, and I would play recreationally. At the same time I was playing these low limit tables, like the $5, $10, or $25 tables, I would read everything about poker that I could. I would buy poker books from Barnes & Noble, and I would also read the forums online, a forum that was called 2plus2, that was a poker website. After playing hundreds of thousands of hands online, I would eventually get better at poker. I would move up to the $50 and $100 no limit tables, and I was beating those games regularly for a rate of 3 to 5 BBs per 100. If you're a poker player, you know what that means. Essentially, it means that I was a winning player, but I wasn't like crushing the games, but I was decent enough where I wasn't losing money. I'd say in the 4 to 5 years of playing poker online, I roughly made $18,000 overall, and that's pretty good. However, when you consider how many hours that I actually spent playing poker, I bet my hourly rate was probably less than $5 per hour. It was right around when I had about $15,000 in winnings and regularly winning at the $100 table games that I wanted to move up to the $200 and the $400 table games. At that same time, there was a new book / poker course released by a really well-known player called Reed Young. I believe his screen name was Shoot AA, so Shoot Pocket Aces, and the name of the book was called The Blue Book. It was supposed to be a whole compendium of everything that he knew about online poker, and he would teach you how to beat the higher limit games. In other words, it was an advanced poker book for advanced players, and I was trying to level up my game to the ultimate highest. Now, this book was notoriously difficult to buy. He wouldn't sell it to just anybody. You actually had to show him how much of a bankroll you were working with. I actually tip my hat to him because he would actually not sell it to people who just had, let's say, a bankroll of $3,000, because it wouldn't make sense. If you're buying a poker book for $2,500, but you only have $3,000 to work with, it's probably not gonna work for you. Anyways, I was selected to buy this book, so I ended up going to my bank. I wire transferred him some money, and then I had to just wait patiently and hope that the book would come in the mail. I did end up receiving the Blue Book. I read it about once or twice, but what I realized was that even though the strategies that he covers in the book are really great, theory is not often execution. A lot of the advanced tactics would actually go over my head, and unless I actually applied those tactics in real time in a poker game, I wasn't really getting that much value out of the book. I think this is pretty common with educational products that are out there. Sometimes you could get invested in a course or perhaps new instructional material, but if you don't actually take the time to understand the material and apply it to the real world, you might not get that much value out of it. I thought that by buying a $2,500 book that I would be instantly transformed to a high limit poker player, but the truth was that I still sucked. The secret to becoming a successful player was probably more than just reading a book. You actually had to apply those principles in real life and put in the work. And I think this is a microcosm of any educational content out there. Just because you buy it doesn't mean you're gonna get the transformation that you want. It's almost like buying a diet plan, but then if you don't stick to the diet, you're not gonna lose the weight. At the end of the day, I thought the purchase was a pretty dumb purchase for myself in particular, but for others, it could have been just as good as gold. My fourth dumbest purchase of my 20s was a $1,000 tuxedo that I wore to a wedding once and then just never wore again. This happened because renting a tuxedo usually costs $300 for the weekend, so I thought to myself, man, why don't I just buy a tuxedo? That way, as long as I wear it a couple more times, I'll probably break even on the cost of renting. I thought I'd be able to wear it to many more future events and weddings, so I went to Nordstrom, I talked to a sales guy there, and I just settled in on the first tuxedo that he kind of showed me. The entire purchase for the tuxedo itself, including the cummerbund, was $1,000, but then you had to buy some extras, for example, the bow tie, as well as these shiny black shoes. Now, here's why it's a really dumb purchase. I haven't worn it since. That's the reason why it's so dumb. It just kind of sits in my closet collecting dust. These days, I wouldn't even know how to tie a bow tie. I don't need to wear a cummerbund, and I haven't been invited to any black tie events since that day. In fact, all the weddings and events that I've been to since then have just been really formal events. However, I can just wear my normal suit. In addition, I've gained some weight since I've been in my 20s, so I don't think the tuxedo would fit these days. I don't think anybody wants to see that either in person or you guys online. I'd probably have to get it tailored to even wear it again, and that's going to just be even more money down the drain. So I really think the lesson here is that if you are going to buy a special piece of clothing for a special occasion, really think about if you're gonna wear it in the future, because if not, it might be worth getting something a lot cheaper and just getting it tailored instead. I find that when it comes to clothing, as long as it fits well, so if you get it tailored, properly tailored, then you don't really have to worry about where it comes from or if it's designer or not. The fifth dumbest purchase that I made in my 20s were Airbnbs when I went on a solo vacation to Europe in 2016. So to give you some backstory here, I went to Europe for 3 weeks from October 2016 to November 2017, and I thought instead of staying in a hotel or a hostel, I'm just going to book an entire Airbnb for myself. I thought it was a good idea because I'd be a lot happier having my own space and my own room, and then I could work out in the room by doing my in-room workouts. This was also a time when Airbnbs were still pretty cool to book, like it didn't have a bad reputation yet, and so I booked 5 Airbnbs across 5 different cities in Europe. That would be London, Paris, Zurich, Munich, and Vienna. The truth is though, is that once I got to these Airbnbs, I felt incredibly isolated as well as a little bit depressed because there weren't that many people to hang out with. It was just me. Even if I were at a hotel, for example, at least I could go downstairs to the hotel lobby, maybe sit by the bar and maybe meet some other travelers. So instead, most of my vacation was just spent alone, walking the streets of whatever city I was in and just looking forward to the next meal. I didn't meet any new travelers while I was traveling alone, and so a lot of it was just me, myself, and I, and therefore I don't think I had the best time that I could have. I think naturally I'm a pretty social person. I derive a lot of fulfillment from the connections that I have in person, and so I think What a better idea would be to stay at a hotel that was close to a hostel, or even just stay at the hostel itself. That way there would be some instant travelers and instant friends that I would get to know, and maybe we could do some group activities together. When you're traveling alone, I think increasing your exposure to opportunities to meet new people is really key, and I just didn't do that because I booked Airbnbs. All in all, I think I spent around $3,000 to $3,500 on these Airbnbs across 15 different nights in Europe. Not too bad, but considering I could have just stayed at a hostel for a lot cheaper and been a lot more social, I probably wish I had done that. I've never been really good at taking vacation by myself, and that was definitely a good lesson for me to learn, and also a very dumb purchase in my 20s. I'm definitely not proud of some of these purchases, and I think that a lot of them could have been avoided as long as I did a little bit more planning or had some extra foresight around them. I just hope that you can learn from my mistakes and not make the same mistakes I did. Hopefully this saves you a lot of money in your own life. So we're gonna be discussing the most common money mistakes each age bracket makes. So that's gonna be the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. So let's get started with your 20s. The first mistake in your 20s that you're gonna make, which is still very common, is just not investing early enough. If a 25-year-old started investing $200 per month, assuming an 8% return, by the time they are 65, they would have a nest egg worth $622,000. But if they wait until 35 to start investing $200 a month, even with the same 8% return, they would end up with less than half of that, so $287,000 by the time they are 65. So by just simply waiting 10 years to start, they'd have $335,000 less, even though they only invested $24,000 less. Those first 10 years represent more than half of the final value because that money has had the longest runway to compound. The second mistake in your 20s you will make is not establishing credit. I was actually at a wedding over the weekend where I met a woman who was 29 years old with no credit score. She's having a hard time renting a new apartment and qualifying for a car loan, and she said that she's been using a debit card her whole life. So a pro is that she's not in any debt whatsoever, but the con is that the lack of a credit score is now affecting her personal life in a huge way. What you can do instead at a young age is just get a starter credit card, put some small transactions on that card, and just automate the payments to avoid any late payments. Since a lot of your credit score is driven by how often you pay on time, just by doing this every month, you'll establish a good credit score in maybe 6 to 12 to 18 months. The third mistake you make in your 20s is buying a new car when you don't need it. Edmunds.com now reports that the average monthly car payment is $748 per month for new cars and $532 per month for used cars. When you buy a new car, you might be overpaying for it because a car incurs a lot of depreciation when you first get it on the front end, and you could be putting yourself into a lot of debt by doing so if you can't afford the payments. I would stick to the 24-10 or the 25-10 rule of car buying that states that you should put 20% down on a car, finance the car for no more than 4 to 5 years, and that your monthly payments should not exceed 10% of your gross monthly income. If you can follow this rule, your car is then safe in terms of affordability. The fourth common mistake in your 20s is slightly controversial, but it's moving out too soon of your parents' home. Now, not everyone's gonna have this option of staying at home with their parents, but if you do have the option, I would try to delay the moment in which you move out completely. Oftentimes, I'll see people in their 20s without an emergency fund and without much savings at all, and they will move into an apartment that they can barely afford. The average age which people move out of their parents' homes is now between 24 and 27, but if you can delay it maybe just even a year or 2 years and really save up a little bit of extra money, I think it will go a very long way, especially considering now that the median rent in the US is now $1,631 per month. And the fifth mistake I see a lot of 20-somethings make is just not budgeting at all. According to debt.com, 69% of people are living paycheck to paycheck now in the United States, and when you live paycheck to paycheck, it's really easy to fall into debt because you might put things on a credit card, or you might have to take out a personal loan just to cover your normal expenses, especially when you're not tracking your money. Now, if you are in debt, there is some good news because 84% of people said that budgeting helped them get out or stay out of debt. So if you don't have a budget, I would at least create a basic one. You want to track your monthly average expenses and figure out what category you're spending the most amount of money on. If you need more help with budgeting, you want to check out some of the videos on my channel. I will link them down below in the description. So those were some basic mistakes that young people make, but as you move up to the decade of the 30s, the mistakes start to become more lifestyle oriented. The first mistake I see that people in the 30s often make is splurging on their wedding. The average cost for a Gen Z, Millennial, and Gen X wedding are $27K, $38K, and $23K respectively. If you live in a more expensive cost of living area, then I could see this cost even being way higher. The biggest costs to factor in for a wedding are usually the number of guests, the venue, and whether or not to invite your creepy uncle, because that could just cost you a lifetime of therapy. Here are the average prices of wedding features according to a popular website, Zola, for a wedding size of 100 guests. You can see that most people spend a lot of money on their venue as well as their food, and also take note that this does not include the cost of an engagement ring. When it comes to your own wedding, if you don't want to spend an arm and a leg, really think twice about who you invite to it, decide on what categories you want to spend more money on, and really what categories you don't really need to splurge on. You can even get creative with ways to save, like using a grandparent's backyard as a venue. A common guideline is to spend no more than 20% of your combined annual income on a wedding. So let's say you and your spouse combine and you guys make $150K per year. Try to target $30,000 for your wedding or less. The number 2 mistake that you'll make in your 30s is neglecting emergency funds. So if you don't have 3 to 6 months worth of expenses saved up by this decade, I think you are making a mistake. You should really focus on buffing that up as your number 1 priority if you haven't already. The 3rd mistake you'll make in your 30s is buying too much of a house and living beyond your means. So when it comes to buying a house, a lot of people forget the hidden costs of owning a single family home. According to a new Bankrate study, quote, the average annual cost of owning and maintaining a single family home in the US is now more than $21,000 per year. And you can see that this is broken down here by category, so you want to make sure you understand what your home ownership costs are actually going to look like before even committing to one of the biggest purchases of your life. The 4th mistake I see people in their 30s making is that they get way too comfortable with debt. In your 30s, since you're in your prime earning years, this is the decade to really start ramping up your net worth, and the last thing you want are credit card payments and other existing loans that are slowing your compounding of wealth. In addition, in your 30s, that's where everything in your personal life will start to intersect. You're starting to get more responsibilities at work. Your family is growing either by the addition of having a kid or two or by having pets. And also you might have to take care of your parents, which you might not have had to do in your 20s. So that might mean with all these things combined, you might be more tempted to take on debt. However, don't let debt derail your compounding, and if you do have to take it on, make sure you have a plan to get out of it ASAP. And the 5th mistake I see people in their 30s making is lifestyle creep. It's tempting to upgrade your lifestyle as your income grows, but if you're overspending on cars, homes, or luxury items, this can quickly slow down your progress towards financial freedom. A good rule of thumb when it comes to increasing your lifestyle is to think about the cost you're debating over a longer term time horizon. If you want to drive a nicer car, think about how much more that will cost you, not just this year, but over the next 5 or 10 years total. I find that when I do this exercise, it really makes me think twice about that expensive upgrade. Okay, moving right along into the decade of the 40s now, you're likely established, have a family, and own a home. The first money mistake I see people in their 40s making is not contributing enough to retirement. Fidelity recommends having between 3x and 6x your salary between the ages of 40 and 50 saved for retirement. That means if you're the age of 40 and you make $100,000 per year, you should have at least $300,000 at age 40 saved for retirement. Another quick rule of thumb to use is the 4% rule that states that you can safely withdraw 4% of your total balance each year in retirement, and by doing so, theoretically, you will never run out of money. So if your nest egg was $1 million, you can safely withdraw 40K or 4% of that balance every year in retirement. You can use this 4% rule to work backwards and see what your total nest egg you should be targeting should be. So do not ignore retirement contributions, because in your 40s, you still have enough time to get your balance really compounding for you. The next money mistake in this decade is not having an estate plan. So if you have dependents that rely on you and you have assets that need to be distributed, you probably should have an estate plan or at least start one. The major components of an estate plan are documents like a living will and a healthcare power of attorney. These are the documents that will state your preferences in case something were to happen to you, and can often even be done really quickly online. Just make sure you have a plan in place so that your family isn't stressed if something were to happen to you. The third mistake I see people in their 40s making is either being uninsured or underinsured. There are 2 main types of insurance I'm going to focus on in this decade, and that's going to be life insurance and disability insurance. When it comes to life insurance, a common rule of thumb is to have coverage that's 10 to 15 times your annual income. So if you make $100,000 per year, you should be targeting between $1 to $1.5 million in coverage. Now that might sound like a lot, but term life insurance is actually quite affordable, especially if you're healthy. I would probably stay away from whole life insurance though, because this is generally not worth it. I've talked about this in some other videos before, but whole life insurance seems to be marketed more for the benefit of the insurance salesman rather than for you. Now, disability insurance is equally important, but often overlooked. If you can't work due to an injury or illness, disability insurance will replace a portion of your income. It's typically 60 to 70% of your salary, and most employers should have this included already, but I think it's also worth looking at yourself if you don't have this benefit. The fourth mistake in your 40s you could easily make is careless spending. Quote, the average debt in America is over $105,000 across mortgages, auto loans, student loans, and credit cards, with debt peaking between the ages of 40 and 49. This mistake is kind of like the lifestyle creep mistake in your 30s, but I want to re-emphasize here that you don't want to get carried away with spending on things that are unnecessary for your life. Your 40s will be a time you might come into extra money, either with more money at your career or that you're past a lot of bigger expenses now, so you have more money to spend. This is still a time you can stay disciplined and don't get into debt for a purchase that you might regret later. And the fifth mistake in your 40s that's very common is trying to make up for lost time with shortcuts, especially if you got a late start. It might be in your 40s that you get more financially literate. Maybe you're watching these videos and you realize, oh man, I am really behind on my retirement planning. As a result, you see a lot of your peers, they're trying to chase hot stocks, get into complex real estate deals, or they might get into speculative trading trying to make up lost time with these shortcuts. So I just want to say, don't do this. You want to just stick with broad-based index funds, consistent contributions, and do the boring stuff because that will actually get you the results that you want. I know it might not be as fast as you want, and perhaps you're falling behind compared to your peers, but the last thing I want to see you do is try to gamble or YOLO your way to financial stability, and then you end up losing it all. Getting into the decade of the 50s now, let's talk about some of the mistakes that we really commonly see. The first mistake is dipping into your retirement funds too early. So some people might be tempted to do this because they are in need of cash to buy something fancy, like a second home, go on a nice vacation, or perhaps they just want to remodel their original home. But you do not want to do this. There is a 10% penalty on withdrawing money before you are 59 and a half, in addition to income tax on the distribution if it's not within a Roth account. So for example, if you're in the 22% tax bracket, an early withdrawal of $10,000 from your retirement account would result in $3,200 in taxes and penalties. I don't think that's worth it. The second mistake in your 50s is avoiding the stock market. Most people would advise you to start being more conservative with your investments when you get slightly older in your 50s. And while that is true, you don't want to go just straight to 100% bond or fixed income allocations. I think you would still want some exposure to stocks because you still have 10, 15, maybe even 16 years left until retirement, and you can still definitely capture some of the upside that equities might provide you. The third financial mistake I see people in their 50s making is still holding on to high interest rate debt in addition to their mortgage. It might be nice to pay off your mortgage, but if the interest rate on your mortgage is say 6% and you have other loans such as credit cards or auto loans with higher interest rates, you should probably cut those first. The 50s are an important time to start getting a hold of your financial life, and if you are still in debt in your 50s, it's going to make your 60s a lot harder to retire comfortably because you might still be anxious about money or carrying around debt, so make sure you ruthlessly go after the higher interest rate debt in your 50s. I think this also applies to your 40s and 30s, but I think 50s is going to be the cutoff here because I want you to enter the 60s with zero debt whatsoever. The fourth mistake I see people in their 50s making is not taking advantage of any catch-up mechanisms with retirement plans. After the age of 50, you can usually contribute more money to your 401k than someone under the age of 50, and the same will go for your IRA. If you have the funds available to contribute to the max in these retirement accounts, I think that's a pretty good idea. You want to max these out, and don't forget to take advantage of any employer matches you might also get. All right, there were only 4 mistakes in the decade of the 50s, but let's go right into the decade of the 60s now because this is the most important decade in my opinion. This is when you will retire. Big mistake number 1 in your 60s is not having a withdrawal strategy. You want to go into your 60s knowing what percentage of your nest egg you will be able to withdraw every single year. Without a plan for how much to take out each year and how to adjust those withdrawals during when the market is up versus down, you're more likely to overspend early, which increases the risk of running out of money later on in life. You also have to account for rising costs like healthcare, inflation, and long-term care. So your expenses could quickly outpace your income, especially if you don't have a strategy going into it. This is where I would definitely suggest checking out some of my videos on the 4% rule, or even talk to a financial advisor in person if you want some more help on your specific situation. Here's an older graph, but you can see that the 4% rule is generally sustainable in most markets since 1926. If you went with a 6% or 8% withdrawal rate, it may not have been sustainable throughout history. Mistake number 2 I see people in their 60s making is that you might not be withdrawing enough money when you retire because you fear running out of money. So quote, recently published research by David Blanchett and Michael Fink found that retirees are withdrawing just 2.1% of their savings annually, far below the traditional 4% rule. That means a lot of people in their 60s are missing out on their dream trips, extra time with their family, or perhaps even a new hobby until it's way too late. Not to mention, a lot of people still pass away with a lot of money left in their retirement accounts. So if our goal is to maximize the life that we live with the money that we do have, and if we've hit all of our targets financially, we should switch our mindsets from savers to spenders, especially in our 60s. Mistake number 3 in your 60s is claiming your Social Security benefits too early. Technically, you're eligible to claim Social Security benefits in America at the age of 62, but let's say you claim it at the age of 62, you actually get a reduced benefit amount of 70% of the benefit. If you wait until the full retirement age of 67, that entitles you to the full benefit, so 100%, and you've already worked 35 to 40 years in your lifetime, what's another 5 more to get that full 100% benefit? So I hope that you can hold off until the age of 67 if you are able to. Mistake number 4 is not having a clear retirement vision. There's a study done of 1,200 older adults, and they found that successful retirement planning involved planning fulfillment, which led to better mental health, self-esteem, and social activity in retirement. The point of this study, in my opinion, is that you should aim to have a plan when you retire of what you're gonna do. After you've been working for 40 years, work is often a source of fulfillment for a lot of people. And I will frequently see retirees retire, but then they don't know what to do with themselves. They get bored because they're sitting around all day, and then what do? They just end up going right back to work. Whether you have some sort of community you're a part of, a hobby you want to take part of, or even an organization you want to help run in your free time, when you retire, you want to make sure you're retiring with some sort of vision and purpose. This will bring you a lot of fulfillment in your retirement years, and that will be more sustainable than just, say, retiring, watching a bunch of TV, and then you get bored. And mistake number 5 that people in their 60s make is neglecting healthcare planning. This one's not the sexiest one out there, but you really want to understand your options for retiree health coverage, such as Medicare, Medicaid, and any supplemental insurance you might need. Medicare eligibility begins at the age of 65, but it doesn't cover everything. There are gaps in coverage like dental, vision, and long-term care that can catch a lot of retirees off guard. According to Fidelity, the average retired couple will need approximately $315,000 saved just to cover healthcare and medical expenses throughout retirement, and that's after accounting for Medicare. So before you turn 65, familiarize yourself with the different parts of Medicare, and if you retire before 65, you'll need a bridge insurance solution until Medicare kicks in. I just want to emphasize that you should have a plan for your healthcare in your 60s. I've come across many investments in my time, especially when I used to be a financial advisor, and here are the 5 that I think you should stay away from, especially if you're a long-term investor. What I've noticed about all of these investments is that they're all pretty common, and you're likely going to come across at least one of these in your life. Now, since you're my friend, I want you to be aware of these. This list will start from the most obvious to the not so obvious, so make sure you stick around for that. Now, starting off with number 1, that's leaving your excess money in a savings account, especially if it's at a big bank. The obvious level of this one is about 5 stars, so the most obvious that it can get, because keeping your cash at a really big bank is only paying you about 0.05% APY. On $10,000, that's only $5 per year, so I think it is actually okay to keep some money on the sidelines and not having to have it invested, just in case you come across some opportunities or the volatile market. I mean, the market is very volatile. However, if you're having your excess cash and not a high yield savings account, so if you just have it at a big bank, I think you're losing out on a ton of value. A lot of the high yield savings accounts right now are paying about 4% per year. So on an investment of $10,000, that's $400 in free money that you could be getting just if you're not lazy enough to keep your money in a big bank. If you're looking for a high yield savings account, just Google high yield savings account, and you're likely going to find at least one that you feel comfortable with. And all you really have to do is make sure that it has FDIC insurance, and what that does is covers you just in case the bank goes bankrupt. I know that's probably not going to happen, but I just wanted to point that out. Also, if you want some immediate returns on a smaller amount of money, say under $10,000, you can still buy Series I savings bonds, and these are savings bonds that are backed by the US government, and they're paying about 6.89% per year right now. There are some nuances to it though, so you might want to read up on that. I'm going to link a resource down below for you guys, and you can buy those on treasurydirect.gov. But for the most liquid option for your money, the high yield savings account is probably going to make the most sense, because then you can take out your money whenever you want. Now, depending on when you watch this video, rates might change. So before you do or take any big action, make sure you check on the rates of your high yield savings accounts, as well as the Series I saving bonds and any other rates that you might find. All right, moving on to number 2. This one is not so obvious, but I will still rate it a 4 out of 5 stars. And these are leveraged funds. This is a type of investment that amplifies the return of whatever you're investing into. In the most common scenario, a leveraged fund will track an underlying index, and they will use financial derivatives like options to try to amplify those returns. That sounds way more complicated than it should be, but it basically means this. So if an index you're tracking is up 1%, you should typically be up 1%. But however, if you invest in that index with a leveraged fund, say a triple leverage fund, if the index is up 1%, that means the fund will be up 3% or 3 times that. That sounds good and all, but let's say the index is down 1%. It actually amplifies your losses too. So in a triple leverage fund, you would actually be down 3%. These financial instruments are usually used for short-term trading and are usually highly volatile. If you're a long-term investor, you're going to want to stay away from these because of 2 things. First is their expense ratios or yearly fees. They're really high, so they're often over 1% per year, which will eat into your returns. And number 2, there's a phenomenon called volatility decay. And this basically means if the index has a lot of ups and downs, like it's going up and down like a roller coaster, with investing with a leveraged ETF, what you'll actually find is even if the index breaks even, but the index is super volatile, you'll still lose money. So let me illustrate this for you. So let's pretend there's an index that starts at 1,000. The index rises 3% on Monday, goes down 7% on Tuesday, goes up 4% on Wednesday, down 6% on Thursday, and then on Friday it's up 8%. So basically it went up and down throughout the week. At the end of the week, the index in the blue line here ended at 1011.36 without any leverage. So it was actually up a little bit over 1%. With a triple leveraged ETF, your results are 980.63 at the end of the same 5 days. Now, why is this? The market moved the same each day, but you're telling me that the leveraged fund is down? This is because when any investment goes down a certain percentage, it actually takes a much larger percentage going back up to break even. For example, a loss of 10% requires you to get an 11% gain to recover. A loss of 30% would require a 43% gain to recover back to break even, and that's the issue here. Let's say your index goes down 10%, that means with the leveraged fund, you're actually going to be down 30%. So if the underlying index then goes up 11% the next day, with a normal index, you'll actually break even, but because of the leveraged fund, you're only going to be up 33%. That still comes up short to the 43% gain that we would need to break even. So as losses get larger, the return required to break even increases at a much faster pace. These are really dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. So if you aren't a sophisticated trader, I would just stay away from triple leveraged funds. Before we move on to number 3, I want to share some good news with you guys, and that is my free newsletter Hump Days is available twice a week. So we cover business and the economy, and we currently have over 12,000 readers. Now, we put a lot of time and effort into it. So if you enjoy the content here on video, you'll probably also enjoy that. The link will be down below for that. And let's actually move on to investment number 3. The obvious level on number 3 is a 3 out of 5 stars, and it is actually whole life insurance. I want to point out that I know that whole life insurance is technically not an investment. However, it's always being advertised to you as an investment because of the cash value portion that they try to sell to you. And that's what we're going to talk about today. To understand how whole life insurance really works, we should explain to you what term life insurance is, because that's the really simplified version of life insurance, and that'll show you how bad of an option whole life insurance is for most people. In term life insurance, you pay a set amount every single month for a death benefit. So for example, for someone who's 30 years old, they'll pay roughly $20 a month for 20 years, and they'll have a $500,000 coverage policy. Think of it like car insurance. You pay $20 a month or $240 a year, and in the case you pass away, your beneficiary will receive about $500,000. After 20 years, the coverage ends, and at that point you can renew it, and it is that simple when it comes to term life insurance. Now, whole life is very different. You pay a very costly monthly premium, or monthly fee as they call it, and that fee is often in the hundreds of dollars per month. The average cost of premiums for a whole life insurance policy is usually 20 times higher than that of term life insurance. So for the average 30-year-old, that's going to be $421 per month. That's about $5,000 per year. Now, the premiums go to funding 3 things. Number 1 is your own death benefit coverage, so that $500,000 policy that we talked about earlier. Number 2 is your salesperson's commissions. And then number 3 is your cash value. And that is what's different about whole life insurance that the insurance salesperson will try to tell you about. They'll say it's a savings component that you can invest and grow with tax advantages. But the truth is that for the first 5 to 10 years that you're funding these monthly premiums, they're actually not going towards your cash value. They go to paying none other than your salesperson in commissions and administration fees, and they go towards funding your own death benefit, and they barely go towards your cash value. So the fees in this case are really front loaded, market, and that's actually causing a ton of opportunity cost here. Take our example above, the difference between whole life and term is going to be $400 a month or $4,800 a year. You could just buy term life insurance instead and invest the difference of $400 a month. And if you compound that at 8% in the market over 20 years, the ending balance is going to be $219,000 and change. A whole life insurance cash value typically returns an annual return of 1 to 3.5% after fees. So after a period of 20 years, the ending cash value is going to be about $142,000 at the high end of that return. Lastly, if you want to use your cash value at any time, you actually have to borrow against it, which sounds nice in theory, but then you actually have to pay a percentage on that money. You're paying a percentage on your own money to actually borrow it from your insurance policy. The purpose of life insurance, in my opinion, if you're 30 years old, is you want to ensure that your kids get to their adult years and that your spouse is taken care of in case of an unexpected passing. So for most people, I think a term life insurance of around 30 years should cover most of those bases, and you don't really need whole life insurance. There are going to be some people in the comments today that say whole life insurance can be beneficial for certain situations, and I do agree. For certain special situations, like let's say you have a child with a lifelong disability and you want lifelong coverage, it could be useful to have whole life insurance. But if you don't have a specific situation like that, it's generally a bad deal. Let's move on to number 4, and that's actually going to be a very common investment in the financial advisor world. It's called a loaded mutual fund. The obviousness level here is a 2 out of 5 stars. Now, if you don't have a financial advisor, you can feel free to skip this section because it probably doesn't apply to you. However, this goes on in the financial advisory world quite a bit. Mutual fund companies can have several types of shares, but the most common are A, B, and C shares. The difference in these shares is usually how the fees are collected. So with A shares, a lot of the fees are up front, and the mutual fund company will try to justify it saying, hey, your expense ratios are going to be lower in the long run, especially if you hold this fund for over 40 years. Now, front-loaded fees can actually be up to 5% or higher. So for example, if you buy a mutual fund with a 5% front load and you invest $20,000 into it, $1,000 of that is going to a fee that's going to pay for the commissions for your advisor, and this causes a conflict of interest, in my opinion. You're going to have to do the math for yourself on if these funds are good for your time horizon, but A shares are typically not a great deal. So let's actually take a look at this example here from American funds, ticker symbol AMRMX. You can see that the front-loaded fee is 5.75%, and you're usually going to be told that if you invest at least $25,000 into this fund, your fees will drop, but they usually just drop 0.5 to 1%, which is still not enough. I personally like to stay away from mutual funds due to their high expense ratios, and I usually opt for a passive index fund instead. You're going to get similar performance without the fees eating into your returns. All right, the last investment that I think is poor for a long-term investment time horizon, and I'm really going to have to emphasize long-term here, are commodities like gold and silver. Now, this is a hot take, and before you come for me in the comments, I know that people love commodities, and in 2023, depending on market conditions, they could actually outperform the market this year. But gold in the very long term is not a really productive asset, according to Warren Buffett. His biggest issue is the fact that gold is just so worthless. According to him, it's not in the value someone is willing to pay for an ounce of it, but in its ability to create wealth. So let's actually take a listen.
Let's say you're taking that $10,000 and you'd listen to the prophets of doom and gloom around you, and instead you'd use the $10,000 to buy gold. You could look at it and you could fondle it and you could, whatever you wanted to do with it. But it didn't produce anything. It was never going to produce anything. And what would you have today? You would have 300 ounces of gold, just like you had in March of 1942, and it would be worth approximately $400,000. So if you decided to go with a non-productive asset, gold, instead of a productive asset, which actually was earning more money and reinvesting and paying dividends and maybe purchasing stock, whatever it might be, you would now have over 100 times the value of what you would have had with a non-productive asset.
Essentially, he's saying he'd rather own a productive asset that compounds and grows over time. Gold's value rises and falls depending on what someone is willing to pay for it, not in its ability to provide income for the owner. Now, of course, this comes with a big caveat. Gold can actually outperform the market, especially in times of geopolitical uncertainty, and it also becomes a good inflation hedge. In fact, there are even stretches of 5 to 10 years where gold can outperform the market. However, if we zoom out far enough, you'll see that gold pales in comparison compared to the market as a whole. For 10 years, I thought I was being smart with my money, when in fact, there were 5 things I was doing subconsciously that ended up costing me a lot of money. I just did the math this morning, and And some of these mistakes will eventually cost me $750,000 or more over the course of my career. And all of these, in my opinion, are avoidable. So I'm sharing this with you today in order for you guys to learn from my mistakes. The first thing that I was completely unaware of was from the ages of around 21 to 26, I had fallen victim to this mentality of, if I can't get rich fast, then why even bother? I grew up in Silicon Valley, California, and in my freshman year of college, that's when Facebook had come out, and it was a completely new website at that time. We were still using things like MySpace and AOL Instant Messenger. I think at this time, the tech scene was just starting to grow, but it wasn't so ubiquitous that, you know, Facebook and Nvidia were everywhere and plastered in every single news article on the Wall Street Journal or CNBC just yet. Fast forward to around 2010 to 2012, that's when I moved home from going to college in Los Angeles. For those of you that don't know, Facebook IPO'd in 2012, and it was one of the biggest IPOs at the time. In fact, I knew a lot of acquaintances were working at startups, and some of them became incredibly rich because they were able to get a really good exit, or they just got acquired by another company and they happened to be an early employee of the company that got acquired. So it was this time in my early 20s, I thought, well, there's really no point in trying to build wealth slowly. I'm just gonna try to join a company that's really hot, try to be an early employee, and then try to get an IPO or an exit. I literally thought that this was the only way to build wealth, that or starting your own business. But what I completely neglected from the ages of 21 to 26-ish was investing in index funds. I thought that investing in the market was a little bit risky. I didn't really understand that 8% was quite a lot, and I thought it was a little bit boring, so I wanted to get rich faster. Now, fast forward to today, and I actually think that Gen Z is having a hard time with this same idea. I think there's this general sentiment that I usually find on TikTok or Instagram Reels that suggests to me that Gen Z has given up on the traditional way of investing slowly and building your wealth. A lot of them are going for these one-off moonshots, trying to invest in a cryptocurrency and hit a 100x, or doing stupid things like sports betting, or even worse, prediction markets. That's where you're betting on things like if there's going to be a government shutdown, or literally the high temp of the New York City area on a random Wednesday. So here's where this mentality actually cost me quite a bit of money. So from the ages of 21 to 26, I just never invested into the market at all. I wasn't making a ton of money at this age. I would say my average salaries were around $40,000 per year, but I was still living at home and I was saving a lot of it. Even if I had just invested $500 a month, so roughly $6,000 a year, that would have been around $31,000 in total for those 5 years that I wasn't investing, that I could have started investing. Now, when I just ran the numbers this morning, it was pretty crazy. I think that $31,000, if I just left it alone in a basic S&P 500 index fund, by the time I'm 65, it would be worth anywhere from $750,000 to over $1 million, depending on the interest rate that you use. So because I chose to not act in my early 20s, the cost of this inaction was actually quite a lot. Even if you think you're waiting for the perfect opportunity, that's still a decision, and the cost of that decision is deciding to earn 0%. So 0% compounded over decades, it's still 0%. I do think that these days it's still possible to budget well and get wealthy slowly. So if you are in the Gen Z cohort, please let me know in the comments how you are feeling. The second subconscious thing that I was doing that cost me a lot of money was that I had a scarcity mindset around money, maybe even up to just 3 years ago. Growing up, my dad liked to keep a certain amount of money in his checking account at all times. It was around $35,000, and when I asked him why he liked to keep that much money in his checking accounts, he would always just say, well, it's really safe to have some extra cash and you want this money just in case. Now, my dad was obsessed with saving money to the point where he wouldn't actually spend it on things that could actually improve our lives. He personally preferred to eat frozen meals at home when he could afford to eat out. We would leave the heater off in the winter, and he sacrificed his own comfort and experiences in order to hoard more cash. He would always say it's because he grew up in a war-torn time in China, so he grew up very poor, and so he developed this hoarding mentality whenever he did start to make money. Now, what people don't tell you online is that a lot of your beliefs and behaviors around money are inherited from your parents. So when it came to me and my dad, I just inherited his scarcity mindset, and I kind of just went about my days without realizing I had this mindset until a few years ago. This mindset also contributed to the fact that I didn't want to invest until the age of 26 because my dad wasn't the biggest investor and he liked to keep a lot of cash on hand. So in turn, I just did what my dad did. Once I educated myself more on personal finance though, I realized that the bigger opportunity cost was simply not investing. When I really looked at the data, I realized that the market on average returned around 8 to 10% per year since 1926, but I had to actually learn to trust that data. So it was around my 26th birthday that I decided to start investing in the market and also abandon number one, which was the get rich quick mentality. So that felt really scary at first, but over time, I think that money has grown in ways that cash sitting in a checking account never could. So I want to share with you guys one of my favorite charts ever. This shows the results of the last 20 years investing $2,000 a year with 4 different investing styles. The first 3 investors invested in stocks, but you can see that investor D kept it in cash. As long as you you invest, even if you have bad timing, perfect timing, or you just lump sum all at once, even in the worst case here, you will still have way more money than investor D who keeps their money in cash. So don't make the same mistake that I did. I would say just build an emergency fund of 3 to 6 months, put your money to work after that, and then really learn to trust the data with a diversified portfolio. The third subconscious thing that I was doing that I had no idea of was that I had zero intention or purpose for my money. I just told you earlier that I didn't start investing until the age of 26, but what I didn't tell you is that even when I did start, I only invested a small portion of my total savings. I still wanted to keep some cash around irrationally. Of course, you could probably say this is also attributed to the scarcity mindset, but I also think that one thing that plays into this is that I didn't have any intention for the money that I was saving. To give you some context, I remember having around $55,000 to $60,000 saved up at the age of 26, and I was living at home, so my expenses were quite cheap. My 6-month emergency fund I calculated was around $12,000, so that means at the time I had $40,000 plus in extra cash that I wasn't using. Now, when I say I wasn't using it, I just mean I had literally no plan for it. It wasn't earmarked for a down payment. I might have wanted to start a business one day, but even then that wasn't a concrete plan. So that money was just there. It was just sitting in a checking account earning basically nothing. So the problem here is that money without a job, it doesn't actually work for you. It just sits there losing value. So the way that I fixed this was that I had to start being more intentional about where my money should be allocated. So first I went onto the subreddit of personal finance where I realized that I should have 6 months of emergency funds saved up, and that was around $12,000. So I set aside that $12,000. I then set aside an arbitrary number at that time in my checking account. I set aside $5,000. I just felt like that was a number that was nice and round and I should never go below that number. I don't know if that was completely rational at that time either, but for me, I just felt like a good amount to have in a checking account for any types of expenses I might have. Then the remainder of that money was going to be my bucket for investing. So that's when I started to slowly invest into the market. I didn't really have a plan though. I didn't dollar cost average or lump sum the entire thing. I would just put chunks of $1,000, $2,000, even $5,000 into the market whenever I felt like it. So really there was no system. It was just on vibes. And now looking back, I know that that was probably not the right choice. So if this is something that you do, like you have no intention for your money, then this is what you should do. So I think number one, you want to figure out what your emergency fund is and be honest about how much you actually spend and what should be in there. And the second is to ask yourself, what is every dollar for? Just in case should not be an acceptable answer, but let's say you want to save for a down payment on a house in 2 or 3 years, that would be acceptable. Anything that doesn't have a purpose should be invested or at least sitting in a high yield savings account, and make sure to give each of your dollars a job. You want to pretend like you're running a company and that each of your dollars is an employee of your company and each of them needs a job in order to be productive. If you can do that, I think you'll be a lot better off in the long term. The next thing I realized in my early 20s that was killing my wealth was simply my friend group. I had friends in my early 20s and we did not care about investing. The conversations never revolved around business or entrepreneurship or how we were going to make more money. Mostly my friends and I were just kind of lost. We wanted to play video games during the week. We wanted to go out on the weekends, and there was really never any education or knowledge sharing among my friends. I would call this a money ceiling, and it's invisible. So when no one around you is normalizing investing, it doesn't even register as an option in your head. Now, even though I grew up in Silicon Valley in my early 20s, I would say that young people still weren't really talking about investing or retirement. But I'll tell you what changed. Basically, when I became a financial advisor and started working in that industry, suddenly I became surrounded by people all day talking about what they were investing in or what ETFs they were going to put different clients in. I would get questions like, did you see the market today? Or, hey, I'm thinking about rebalancing my portfolio. What do you think? All these types of things I was hearing was causing me to be more aware of this world. I would argue that if you're watching this video right now, you're already kind of surrounding yourself in an environment where we're talking about wealth and investing. So that's really great to give yourself some credit. And I also want to say, try taking a look at the people that you surround yourself with. If none of them are talking about wealth building or investing, you might want to look at different online communities or in person where people are having these conversations that you really want to be a part of. Now, I'm not blaming any of my friends for anything. They were all great people and we're still friends to this day, but the environment that we created was just not conducive to wealth building. Now, this next subconscious wealth killer that I experienced for 10 years was that I was risk averse in the wrong way. What do I mean by that? One of the things that I was afraid of when it came to investing was simply losing money. I had just graduated right after the financial crisis, so having the idea that the stock market could go down 35, 38% in such a short period of time, that was really fresh in my mind. So I was risk averse when it came to investing, as you can probably tell and understand throughout this video, but I was completely blind to a different type of risk, which was inflation risk as well as opportunity cost, and that was the actual wealth killer. Inflation erodes your purchasing power about 2.5 to 3% every year, So in about 24 years, that means you will lose about half the value of your purchasing power in dollars. And in terms of opportunity cost, if your money isn't invested in anything, well, that money could be working for you elsewhere, earning you actual money. And so that's the opportunity cost I'm talking about. So if you're sitting on a pile of cash right now because you're waiting for the right time or because the market feels too risky, you need to understand that you're actually not really avoiding any risk by doing so. What you are doing is just choosing a different type of risk. That risk is inflation risk as well as opportunity cost of that money. I'm gonna go over how you should not invest and some general investing mistakes that I see beginners making. First thing that you should not be doing is to panic sell. This is one of the biggest glaring mistakes that I see all skill levels of investing doing. And if you think that you're not the type to panic sell, just listen to this. A study was done in 2021 that took into account 650,000 individual brokerage accounts. They found that the average person who tends to panic sell has one of the four following characteristics. So either they were a male, they were over the age of 45, they were married, or they had dependents. Now, the key characteristic that was similar among all of those groups of people was that they declared themselves as excellent investors. In other words, if you thought you were really good at investing, you were actually the one that was most likely to panic sell all of your investments. And a panic sell is described as you selling off 90% or more of your assets within a single month. The worst part of all this is that 30.9% of the investors who panic sell never actually reinvest or re-enter the market at any time. And that can be really devastating because according to Bank of America, some of the best returns may follow some of the biggest dips. You can see in this table since 1930, missing the S&P 500's 10 best performing days every decade led to a total return of 28%. However, someone who stayed invested through the ups and downs may have had a 17,715% return. Here's another example in the decade of 2010. If you missed the best 10 days, the market returned 95% for you. But if you had just stayed invested, you would have gotten twice that much or 190% in the market. While the paper concluded that according to data, panic selling wasn't the 100% worst thing an investor could do, what it would lead to more often than not is more negative emotions associated with investing in general. That's because you're probably emotionally scarred from getting out of the market by panic selling. So imagine you lose 50% of your entire portfolio by panic selling, and then all of a sudden, okay, you want to re-enter the market now, but you're hesitant and you're anxious because what if you re-enter the market and it goes down even further? Now, the sensible thing to do, according to Warren Buffett, especially in a volatile year like 2023, is to be greedy when others are fearful and to be fearful when others are greedy. Since we are expecting a lot of volatility in 2023, there will be multiple points throughout the year where you might succumb to your emotions and might think about panic selling, but I promise you, if you just stay invested for the long term and keep a long-term perspective, it's better that you don't panic sell. So according to the data, if you do stay invested, your portfolio is going to be a lot better off for the long term. I mean, you just saw in that table that if you missed some of the best days, that your return is going to be literally halved. That's the thing that I want to impart with you guys today, which is maybe in 10 or 20 years from now, if you look back at the stock prices of today, they're going to seem a lot lower in comparison. So remember, guys, have a long-term mindset and keep at it. The second thing that I would not invest in, or at least be hesitant to invest in, are growth stocks. In 2023, we're going to be expecting more federal interest rate hikes, which means that the federal funds rate is going to go up at least in the first half of 2023. Growth stocks, for anyone new out there to investing, is basically a company that is using all of their capital to grow and expand as quickly as possible. A famous growth stock right now is Tesla. Now, when you think of Tesla, you don't really think of it as a growthy stock because it's been around for quite a long time. However, the truth is that Tesla has been trying to innovate in the electric vehicle space, as well as they're trying to disrupt all other types of industries. They keep experimenting with different products, and it's still a stock that's trying to grow faster than the average stable company out there. Now, why should you think twice about investing in growth stocks in 2023? A huge reason has to do with the fact that growth stocks really leverage debt and borrowing. Because of interest rates going up overall in 2023, a lot of growth stocks are going to be hesitant to take out loans because the interest on those loans is going to be much higher. So therefore, they're not going to leverage as much borrowing, and therefore their growth is going to be a lot smaller. There are going to be some companies that do really well in a higher interest rate environment. And if you are interested in learning what those companies are, you can check out my latest video on how Warren Buffett would invest in 2023 because he goes over that exact scenario. For example, consumer staple stocks and financial stocks tend to do well in a higher interest rate environment, as well as other stocks that don't rely on economic growth, such as insurance. All right, the third biggest mistake of investing investing in 2023 is going to be keeping your cash in a checking account that is not yielding you higher than 0.1 or 0.2% on your money. If you've seen some of my videos, you know that it's okay to keep some cash on the sidelines for investing opportunities or any big opportunities that you're going to see in 2023. However, if you have your cash just sitting in a big bank, for example, like a Chase or a Wells Fargo, and it's not earning you any interest, you are losing a ton of money on your deposit. Because interest rates from the Federal Reserve are so high for the foreseeable future, there's a simple and easy way to get 3.75, even 4 or 4.25% on your money while it sits safely in a bank account. Most people are just too lazy to move their money out of a big bank checking account into a high yield savings, and according to a recent discovery, Americans are leaving $42 billion of interest on the table per quarter because they refuse to get any amount of high yield savings account. That's absolutely crazy to me. So according to this study, the 5 banks, Bank of America, Citi, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, and Bancorp paid an average of 0.4% interest on their consumer deposits. That's about 1/10 of the interest rate that you could get from a high yield savings account. For example, Ally Bank, Wealthfront, and even Robinhood is even offering close to 4% right now, and it's all FDIC insured. If you have any extra cash that's laying around, you want to make sure you move that money into a high yield savings account as soon as possible, because let's put it this way, on a $10,000 deposit, for example, that's going to be around $400 of free money that you're leaving on the table, or off the table, or whatever the expression is, every single year. If you're looking for more options on where to open a high yield savings account, you can literally just Google high yield savings account, where to open, and you'll be able to find a lot of options, and hopefully one that's more comfortable for you. Just make sure that it has FDIC insurance so that you are insured in case the institution ever fails. All right, the next way that you should not invest in 2023 is to copy your friends without understanding the basis for that investment. Just like in school, you don't want to copy your friends' homework because you're not going to learn anything about the actual material. And same thing with investing. If you just blindly copy your friends' investments, it could actually be a lot worse because you could lose a lot of money. Especially in 2023, we're going to get a lot of negative headlines in the news. So people are going to say that there's going to be the fear of a recession, the economy is collapsing, etc., etc. And whenever there's fear, there's going to be bad actors that are trying to capitalize on your fear and your emotions. If you follow a lot of people on social media, you might log on to Instagram one day in 2023 when the market is having a bad day, and you see someone post their trade, and you might be tempted to copy their trade. However, if you don't understand the reason why they are making that trade or why you are blindly following that trade, you're just asking for a ton of trouble. Because the thing is that investing is a super personal process. You need to assess your own age, your own risk tolerance, and your own time horizon, and what investments would suit into that strategy. For example, I have a friend, he has his house paid off, he has his 401k maxed every single year, and he still has a $200,000 portfolio in his Charles Schwab account that he just plays around with. He'll post about it on his Instagram, he'll buy meme stocks, he'll buy random option plays, he'll buy random commodities. And the thing is that if he lost his $200,000, he would be financially no different than he is today. But you might only have $200,000 to your name in total. And if you copied my friend's investing plays, you would just be asking for a ton of financial ruin. The main takeaway I'm trying to teach you in 2023 is that emotions are going to be super charged. So especially with the media headlines. So you want to make sure that you're investing in things that you fully understand, because even if you invest in something you fully understand and it fails, at least you learn something about what investment decision you just made. I also want to bring up that you are accountable for your actions when it comes to investing. So even though you see your friends post about something on social media, it's ultimately you that pulls the trigger at the end of the day. So don't listen to everybody and don't listen to the noise. Really make that decision for yourself, and you're going to be a lot better of an investor in the long term. The number 5 thing that I would not do when it comes to investing in 2023 is to try to time the market. And you're going to see a lot of investors try to time the market in 2023, especially if there's volatility or a lot of big dips. Here's an interesting study from the Schwab Center for Financial Research. It compares 5 investing styles of 5 hypothetical long-term investors. Each of these investors is given $2,000 at the beginning of every year for 20 years, starting in 2000 and ending in 2020. In this hypothetical situation, each person has a crystal ball, so they know exactly what the market will be throughout the year. The first person times the market perfectly, which means that he or she buys in at the lowest point every single year, and some years that might not even be till September, or October, but they do buy at the lowest point every single year. The second person just invests immediately whenever they receive the $2,000 every year. The third person dollar cost averages into the market. The fourth person has the worst timing possible, as in they buy at the top every single year. And the last person just stays in cash. Now, who do you think did the best in terms of performance? If you said the first person, which is the person that was able to time it perfectly every single year, that would actually be the correct answer, but that's kind of an unrealistic thing because they were absolutely perfect in their timing of the market. The person with perfect timing had a portfolio size of 151K over 20 years, but right behind him was investing immediately and dollar cost averaging, both at around 135,000. Even the person who had poor timing had $121,000 at the end of 20 years, but the worst case scenario was to leave your investment in cash. The takeaway here is that perfect timing is statistically impossible, so it's likely that we're not going to get that $151,000 result, but investing immediately or dollar cost averaging, those actually produce pretty similar results, and it's going to be your next best option. I personally like dollar cost averaging over time, especially weekly or every other week. That way, if there are dips or even spikes in the equity that I'm trying to buy, at least I'm getting an average price that's consistent over time. So the old adage, time in the market beats time in the market, still rings true in this scenario, especially it's backed up by data, and hell, even bad timing is better than keeping it in cash. The only scenarios where you want to keep cash on the sidelines is that if you have a big purchase coming up in the next 1 or 2 years, for example, a fancy wedding, or maybe you're trying to buy a house, you might not want to risk it in the market. There are 5 wealth killers that you need to avoid at all costs in this day and age, and I'm confident that if you're able to remember these throughout your life, that you'll not only potentially save thousands of dollars, but you might even save tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. Let's get started with one that's a really hard truth that I've never even spoken about on this channel before, and that is divorce. The statistics around married people getting divorced are pretty jarring, so let me just read a couple of them to you because these are the ones that stood out the most to me. Number 1, the US has the 6th highest divorce rate in the world, with 40 to 50% of married couples actually initiating divorce. Number 2, the second and third marriages have a higher divorce rate of 60% and 73% respectively. That means if you get divorced the first time around, that means the next time around, you actually have a higher chance of divorce for your second and third marriages. So what does that tell me? It tells me that you better be really sure of who you're marrying the first time around, because if you do end up getting divorced one time, this could be a bad vicious cycle. Each divorce costs an enormous amount of money, that's generally understood, but there are a lot of hidden costs as well that we're going to talk about shortly. Now, the most surprising fact of all is that even with all of these divorces and these statistics, that only 15% of married couples actually agree to sign a prenuptial agreement. The top reasons for divorce include lack of commitment, infidelity, too much conflict and arguing, getting married too young, as well as financial problems. Now, it's easier said than done to try to find a partner that doesn't have a lot of these traits, because a lot of the times, a lot of these problems don't actually get found out until later on in the marriage. As far as why divorce is such a wealth killer, studies have shown that a divorce on average can cost around $20,000, and that's not including child payments, alimony payments, or legal fees. Realistically, I think it's a lot more than that, especially if one partner has a lot more in assets than the other. They could lose 50% of their assets to the other partner, and then that just kills your wealth building altogether. When you get a divorce, there are a bunch of hidden costs as well, according to this article from Brian O'Connell. So for example, if you want to split the home that you were sharing with your spouse, that often involves refinancing the home, selling the home, and that actually could lead to higher interest rates, which could cost you a bunch more money. Or if you're selling the home, there's just a bunch of costs involved with selling a home as well. So example, closing costs as well as realtor fees, etc. And what if the real estate market sucks when you're trying to sell a home? You don't really want to sell a home in a buyer's market, but sometimes you might be forced to. Second, in terms of retirement savings, splitting the funds is costly as well, because if you're splitting the funds, you might have to withdraw them too early, which means you have to take a penalty for those retirement accounts, as well as additional legal fees, because splitting funds, especially for retirement, require a court order as well. Number 3, moving costs. If you have to move somewhere, or if your spouse has to move somewhere, that includes a lot of costs involved with moving, but you also have to split assets like your art or your furniture, etc. Number 4, business ownership can also get really messy, especially if the business was started during the marriage. It might be considered marital property. The article references the fact that whenever you want to split a business as well, you have to go get it professionally valued, and that could cost upwards of $5,000 to $15,000 for that alone. And lastly, emotional and physical health. So having a divorce can really mess with your head. It can be really tough for both parties involved, and that might involve you getting therapy, getting different types of medication, or types of counseling. Let's not forget forget the fact that it might be harder to earn money when you are in a poor mental state as well. Now, obviously, a lot of these costs can be avoided if you had a prenuptial agreement in place, but as we reported earlier, only about 15% of married couples actually opt for that. There are a lot of benefits of having a prenup that many people don't talk about, but it's not the most romantic thing to say to your partner, hey, listen, in case this doesn't work out, here's a document that you need to sign in the event that you turn out not to be the one that I'm going to care for in sickness and in health till death do we part. While they're not the most romantic, they can definitely save your wealth because prenups can protect each spouse's assets from being subject to division during a divorce. Number 2, it can protect you against the other partner's debts if there are any. And number 3, I think they offer a lot of peace of mind and financial security for both partners in how the different types of assets and liabilities will be handled in the case of a divorce. So basically, who you marry is a really, really important decision of your life. They could either bring you up, you could chase your wildest dreams together, and even grow your wealth together. Or it could go the other way. So really make sure you choose wisely. I, of course, am not married, but my dad has been divorced 3 separate times, and each time he got divorced, he did say it set him back quite a bit in terms of wealth building. And I got a front row seat to 2 of those 3 divorces, number 2 and number 3, which was my mother and the next wife, but I was not alive for the first one. All right, the second wealth killer on our list is a cameo from the most viewed video on my channel, and that is a car. A car is a silent wealth killer because society often attributes status and prestige to having a nice car. The average cost to own and operate a car, according to AAA in 2023, was $12,182 per year, which was a 12% jump over 2022, where the average cost was $10,728. This is attributed to a jump in new vehicle prices, depreciation ticking upwards for certain models of cars, as well as car insurance has just really exploded this year in terms of costs. So much so that the average car payment for a new vehicle is now $738 per month, and that was the last reported number as of Q4 2023. I bet it's a lot higher even now. People seem to like to give each other props whenever someone else gets a new car, but no one ever talks about how much they owe on those new cars. And that's the thing with cars, because so much of our identity is wrapped up with what type of car that we drive, we often make poor financial decisions to afford a car that is slightly out of our budget. 99% of the time, cars are going to depreciate or have a reduction in their value due to wear and tear. And car depreciation is one of the biggest reasons why I think it's not a great asset to invest your money into, because you are literally having your money go down in value over time. If you want to save money on this category, I always say to avoid buying a new car, because famously, whenever you buy a new car and then you drive it off the lot, you immediately lose 10 to 15% in value right there. If you look at any car depreciation curve, you can see that the best time to buy a car is usually when it's 3 to 5 years used. This is when most of the depreciation has been chipped off the new car already, so that is the sweet spot to buy a car. And oftentimes a 3 to 5 year used car is not going to be a problematic car in terms of repairs and maintenance as well. I think it makes sense to buy a car that usually has around 30,000 miles or is 3 to 4 years used, because it still basically drives like new, especially if the model didn't change that much. Wealth killer number 3, staying on the sidelines when it comes to investing. When people are thinking about investing, but the market is close to all-time highs, they generally say, oh man, I'm gonna wait a little bit until it cools off. Or another common theme that I see is that if the market is in bear market territory, people will exit their positions and wait for another time to re-enter. But waiting around is one of the most guaranteed ways of not getting wealthy in your lifetime. According to Fidelity, here's the hypothetical growth of $10,000 invested in the S&P index from 1980 to the end of 2022. You can see here that if you just stay invested all the days, your balance would be well over $1.08 million. If you miss just the best 5 days in the market in that time period, your gains would be 38% less. That's a huge impact for just not being invested. And the chart/table actually gets a lot worse. Missing the best 10 days in the market loses you 55% of your hypothetical gains. Missing 30 days of the best days loses you 83%, and missing 50 of the best days in that time period loses you 93% of all the hypothetical gains that you could have had if you just stayed in the market. Obviously, not being invested at all is probably going to cost you the most amount of money, and that's the cardinal sin of this channel, so make sure you do not do that. But the impact of being invested on the best days cannot be underestimated. You really need to have those best days in your portfolio to compound your wealth even more. So unless you're retiring soon and you need need to preserve that short-term wealth, it's better to just stay invested in the market and not try to time it at all. Market volatility is going to happen no matter what, and when in doubt, you want to zoom out. So this graph shows that despite market pullbacks, stocks usually go up over the long term. You can even see that during horrible black swan events like Black Monday in 1987, September 11th, and the pandemic, all of these and more, that the market tends to go upwards and to the right. I think so many people just often stay in cash because they are afraid to lose their money, and that's a completely rational approach to have. But the idea is that if you're just staying in cash and not getting any return on it at all, then inflation is eroding your money because your purchasing power is going down because of it. At the very minimum, keep your cash in a high yield savings account. At least that way you're getting at least a 4 to 5% return on your money. I will leave some links down below for my favorite ones. But when interest rates are low, you're not probably going to get those returns in high yield savings anymore. So that's when you need to turn to the stock market, which historically averages around 8 to 10% per year. Now, speaking of inflation itself, number 4 on our list of wealth killers is not accounting enough for inflation. We know that because of the recent inflationary period that we've been in, the price of goods have gone way up over the past few years. In June of 2022, the year-over-year change of all the prices of goods was close to 9% year over year, and now it's about settled in the 3 to 3.5% range every time we get a new inflation report. Because of this, we're seeing the immediate impact of inflation in the prices that we see every day from just some 4 years ago. It wasn't that long ago that I could get a Chipotle bowl for, let's say, $10 and then my whole week's worth of groceries for under $100. But these days, the norm now seems to be $15 for a Chipotle bowl and $150 for groceries. I'm sure some of you guys pay way more than that for groceries as well, but for me, that's what I visually see in my day-to-day life. Chipotle now costs 50% more, and my groceries seem to cost more for a lot less as well. The effects of inflation are definitely being felt, and the sad part is that usually prices go up, but they never really come down. I asked my dad about the periods of high inflation back in the 70s and 80s when the percent change of inflation year over year was 10 to 15%. And he said that the situation back then is very similar or basically identical to the situation today. The prices just never came back down. In addition to inflation, interest rates have come up to combat that inflation, but as a result of that, homes are now less affordable than they have ever been. New estimates show that in 2024, 103.5 million households are not able to afford a median-priced new home based on the standard underwriting criteria. That's where all of your housing payments, insurance payments, and property taxes should be no more than 28% of your household's gross income per month. The takeaway here is that if you're not trying to adjust for inflation by altering your monthly budget, or you're not getting a raise, or you're not asking for a raise, then the value of your money or your purchasing power of your money is shrinking over time and eroding due to inflation. In addition, this wealth killer combined with any of the wealth killers in today's video is going to definitely compound your problems over time. It's definitely worth paying attention to and trying to adjust your budgets accordingly. If you are looking for videos on affordability, I have 2 great ones on the 2 biggest categories of spend that people usually have, which are cars and houses, and I will link those down below so that you can check that out after this video. The number 5 wealth killer today is debt, especially high interest rate debt, and especially if you get into the wrong kinds of debt. There are many cases in which having some debt is going to be completely acceptable and also necessary for your wealth building journey. For example, buying a home, you're going to get a mortgage. If you're going to get an advanced degree, then you probably want to take out some student loans. Financing a car, you may need to actually take out an auto loan, especially if you're on the younger side. And even starting a business, you might even ask your bank for a small business loan. But whenever you leverage debt, you must consider the long-term implications of what that debt may be. By servicing your debt, you are taking on opportunity costs of your dollars because those dollars could be used towards saving or investing, but instead are going towards off paying your debt payments. Not to mention that when you have high interest rate debt specifically, if your balance gets a little bit too high, then it could be really hard to pay off that debt, and that could become a vicious cycle. If you're the type of person that usually has a credit card balance of $1,000 to $3,000 all the time, then maybe having a credit card is not for you. Because if it ever gets to the $5,000 to $10,000 balance range on a credit card, the high APRs of a credit card are going to be very dangerous and possibly keep you entrapped in debt for a long period of time. The average APR for credit cards is 22.63% as of February 2024. So that means if you have a balance of $10,000 on a credit card, every single month you are paying $187 towards your monthly interest payments. Debt also just limits you in terms of flexibility. So if you had a certain loan that you feel like you can't walk away from, then you might be stuck in a job that you might not want to work. Or you're just unable to take advantage of new opportunities, because if you do end up taking a new opportunity, it could put you in financial trouble. So what can we do about all this? We want to make sure that our debt payments are within reason, and according to most financial experts, you want to make sure that your total debt payments do not exceed more than 35 to 40% of your gross monthly income. Those debt payments have to encompass your mortgage payments, your student loans, car payments, etc. According to good home buying rules, your total housing spend should not exceed 30% of your gross income. So if you are abiding by that, that means you only have 5 to 10% left of your gross income every month for other debt payments. You never want to be in a spot where you're so over leveraged that if the economy or the markets ever took a turn, that you're going to be underwater on your assets, or even worse, you have to sell some of your assets to service the debt that you owe. Because that would be the ultimate wealth killer, is that if you had to sell off some of your assets just to cover debt, and that is going to kill your wealth, because usually when you get an asset, you just want to grow it over time and not have to sell it prematurely. If I had to start from scratch and start investing all over again, this is what I would do step by step to build a stock portfolio. Now, had I known this when I was younger, I think my portfolio size would be at least 2 to 3 times what it is today. And so here are 8 key tips that I would give my younger self if I were to start all over again. And tip and step number 1 is to actually start my Roth IRA way earlier. For a long time, I had no idea what this account did, and so I actually started it at the age of 26 after doing a lot of research online, and I had already missed out on 8 years of potential contributions. That was mistake number 1, and I actually made 2 extra mistakes when it came to the Roth IRA. The first mistake that I made within my Roth IRA is that I chose holdings that were too conservative for my risk profile when I was younger, and number 2, I didn't make the maximum contributions available to me, even though I had the means to do so. The first mistake of being too conservative stemmed from the fact that I didn't really know what my goals were with Roth IRA investing in general, and so I just ended up going online to Google and looking up a common stock portfolio that everybody was using, and I copy and pasted that into my own Roth IRA. It was right around this time when I was learning more about investing, because I was a financial advisor, that I realized that my investing had to match my own needs. I realized that I could be way more aggressive within the Roth IRA because of how the account worked, which is basically where every gain that you get within your holdings in the Roth IRA, they are tax-free. So the number 1 thing in my mind that we should be optimizing for within the Roth IRA is capturing as much upside as possible, since we're not going to have to pay that in capital gains tax. Now, if you're in another country, you likely have something equivalent to the Roth IRA, but the idea is pretty similar, is that in tax advantaged accounts, we can afford to be a little bit more aggressive, but not too aggressive to the point where our portfolio might actually busto and go to zero. So I'm not talking about making crazy bets on any penny stocks or anything like that, but I'm talking about making slight adjustments to the standard portfolios that you might see online, just to increase the notch of aggression slightly higher. So that's basically tip number 2 today, which is to match your holdings to your risk. So here's an example of what I personally mean. This is going to be an elaboration on tip number 1, but initially when I had my Roth IRA, I went with what's called a 3-fund portfolio. This asset allocation consists of 3 ETFs. One is typically a total US stock market ETF. The other is a total international stock market ETF, and lastly, a total bond market ETF. The typical split is usually 80% in stock ETFs, so international and US, as well as 20% in the bond market ETF. Again, there's nothing wrong with these choices, and typically they are set it and forget it type of investments for most people. However, I realize that I'm not really a conservative, nor am I really a passive investor, so it didn't really suit my exact needs, especially at a really young age. So looking back, we can see here for the first 5 to 6 years that I had my Roth IRA, my risk and holdings were slightly mismatched. Bonds were yielding very little, and it was probably me playing it a little bit too safe, which is probably fine, but you can see that in the annual returns from 2012 to 2022, ticker symbol BND, which is the total bond market fund that I was talking about, just performed rather poorly. So even though it didn't make much sense to own bonds in a Roth IRA at a young age, I was blindly just following the method that I had found online. I think the lesson here was that for my Roth IRA, I could have definitely been more aggressive by choosing some individual names and adding it to my ETF mix already. In terms of individual names that I would personally add to my Roth IRA these days, I'm thinking of big companies that are probably still going to be around in 30 or 40 years when I retire. So I'm thinking companies like Apple, Google, Home Depot, and Costco, those types of companies. For example, if we chose a stock like Home Depot and compared it to the benchmark of the S&P 500 since 1982, so about 40 years ago, If you had invested $1,000 in Home Depot back then and reinvested the dividends, you would have approximately $11.5 million today. Now, obviously, those numbers are absolutely massive, and I cherry-picked Home Depot just because of this exact example. But if you had invested $1,000 in the S&P 500 in 1982, you'd have over $101,000 today. Still, that's not bad, but you are going to be off by a factor of 100. You could obviously have stocks that underperform that same 40-year stretch as well. So an example here is AT&T. $1,000 worth of AT&T back in 1984, so not exactly 40 years, but that would only be roughly worth about $5,171 today, which means it's way underperformed the S&P 500 since then. So higher risk equals higher reward in this case. There's no way that in 1982 we would have known that Home Depot, a small company that just IPO'd, would become the Home Depot that is today. However, I'd rather take a shot at the most possible gains, especially in a Roth IRA, because all the gains that you're going to capture within that account are going to be tax-free at the end of the day. So I'd probably have a Roth IRA that looks like the following. It's still diversified enough with an S&P 500 ETF like VOO, and I still have some international exposure with ticker symbol VEU. There are also then 4 individual names that I think could be great capital appreciators down the road. And as I got older, I think I would shift some of these holdings into more fixed income type of holdings, think municipal bonds or even bond funds. However, if I'm under the age of 30, I'm probably going with something like this for sure. So my point here is pretty simple. Investing and building a stock portfolio is going to be different for everyone. And that's actually going to bring me to my third tip, which is simply figuring out your own investing style as soon as possible is going to benefit you quite a lot, especially by understanding the holdings that are going to fit that investment style. Chances are you probably inherently know deep down inside if you're more on the conservative side or you're on the risk-taking side. Now, if you don't know what your risk tolerance is, there are plenty of online questionnaires out there that you can answer some questions and it'll tell you what your risk tolerance is likely going to be. I will link one down below, but basically after you figure out what your risk tolerance is, you want to figure out what your time horizon is as well. Are you investing for retirement, or perhaps you're investing for a shorter term goal, like you're investing to get a down payment on a house or perhaps save for a wedding? It's important to understand the why of why you are investing because it's going to guide a lot of your investment decisions down the road. Okay, so here's a spectrum of risk to reward ratio. You can see at the very bottom we have a savings account. That's just going to be very low risk and very low reward. And hopefully that savings account is just liquid money sitting in a high yield savings account so that you at least get some interest on it. You can see that as we go along the x-axis into the risk section, that government bonds and corporate bonds do show up, and then US stocks and international stocks are on the riskier section, but they do give you more of a potential reward. The point of this graphic is just to show you that different investments are going to suit different people, and you can tailor your own stock portfolio with these different types of investments that you gravitate towards. That is something that I wish I knew sooner, which is to pick investments that suit my needs, and that's kind of what I've already talked about in tip number 1, as well as a little bit in tip number 2. Okay, so tip number 4 is to figure out what type of accounts you actually want to invest in. When I was starting out personally, I had a really small 401k, I had a Roth IRA at the age of 26, and I also had a taxable brokerage account. Now, every time I got my paycheck, I wasn't really too sure how to distribute that among those 3 accounts that I had. I was asking myself, should I just put it all in the Roth IRA? Should I still contribute to my 401k, or should I just have all the money in a taxable brokerage account so that I could have access to it at any time? I didn't know. Now, if you want to do it the financially optimal way, I'd probably prioritize the Roth IRA first, as well as any match that I would be getting from my employer for my 401k. Any money left over after that, if I needed to contribute to investing, I would either put it in a taxable brokerage account or I'd finish up maxing up my 401k. I also need to mention that there are custodial accounts for kids, there are 529 plans, as well as self-employed plans for those people that have their own businesses. So there's just a lot of accounts that are out there when it comes to investing, and you need to do your research to figure out what is the best one for you. For me personally, I found that the Roth IRA and a taxable brokerage account was enough for me and my own needs, and so that's what I personally go with. Tip number 5 is to contribute more to your retirement account, especially in a 401k. Now, when it comes to the 401k, we know that the average contribution rate in the United States is between 6 to 8% per paycheck. That's across all age ranges, and in fact, by the time you're the age of 55 to 64, the average 401k balance is about $256,000, and the median is is just around 87K, and I don't think that's just enough money to retire these days. Looking at these statistics earlier this year, most people expected that they needed about $1.3 million to retire, yet most people don't even have about 1/10 of that actually saved. If I could do it all over, I would probably aim to increase my saving and contribution rate to closer to 10 to 15% of my gross paycheck. Starting from a really young age and just sticking with an S&P 500 low-cost index fund will probably get you a lot further than the average and the median balances in the United States right now. You can also invest in what's called a target date fund. So those are the funds that usually have a year next to it or corresponding to it. So an example would be like the VFFVX 2055 target date fund. That means you plan to retire around 2055 and want a fund that is basically set it and forget it until then. Quote, these do have active fund managers and they gradually shift each fund's asset allocation to fewer stocks and more bonds, so the fund becomes more conservative as you get closer to retirement. The key here is to keep it simple in the 401k, take advantage of any 401k match, contribute regularly, and then just let compound growth take over. In terms of maxing out the 401k, I don't really know if that's completely necessary as long as you're aiming to save between 15 to 20% of your household income across all of your other accounts. All right, so tip number 6 is within the 401k, look for funds that are really low in fees. 401k plans are typically not super flexible with the offerings that they offer within the own 401k, so it really depends on the company that you belong to. However, you want to look for a well-diversified fund, especially if it has a very low expense ratio. For example, Fidelity's FXAIX is a common one that you can find and was available in one of my friend's 401k plans when I was doing research for this video. And the expense ratio in that particular fund is 0.015%, which makes it a really cheap option within the 401k. You should probably note though that 401k plans generally are a little bit more higher in fees due to the administrative fees and maintenance fees of having the 401k in the first place. Those are generally unavoidable, but the tax advantages of the account are so good, and any match that you get from your company are going to just balance that out entirely. All right, my 7th tip, this is a really important tip here, is to figure out diversification, especially in a taxable brokerage account, and let me explain. A taxable brokerage account is actually going to be a really good thing for shorter term investments because you have access to your money at any given time. The 401k and the IRA, they're both great accounts, but they're retirement accounts, and so you generally have to lock up your contributions until you retire to get access to that money. Now, within my own taxable account, I actually had a really simple investing strategy that I started off with. I bought 15 to 20 different stocks across 6 or 7 different sectors, and I tried not to have more than 5% of my total portfolio invested in one singular holding. I later learned that this was Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank's favorite method of investing.
Number 2, diversification really matters. So I never want to own more than 5% in any one name, and you know that really works when you go through periods like 08, 09, we have volatility in sectors.
So I think here, if you're a passive investor, looking for diversification is probably the best play. Now, the mere fact that Kevin says that you don't want to have more than 5% in one singular holding, by virtue of that exact statement, that actually means you're going to have more than 20 different holdings. Because you can't really own 10 or 15 stocks at 5%. That just doesn't add up to 100%. You're going to have at least one stock in there that's going to be worth more than 5% of your portfolio. So that would actually mean you're holding 20 different stocks or more, according to Kevin O'Leary. Now, when it comes to owning that many stocks, Warren Buffett actually thinks that could be a mistake. So let's actually listen to what he says.
Diversification is a protection against ignorance. I mean, if you want to make sure that nothing bad happens to you relative to the market, you own everything. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that is a perfectly sound approach for somebody who does not feel they know how to analyze businesses. If you know how to analyze businesses and value businesses, it's crazy to own 50 stocks or 40 stocks or 30 stocks probably. Because there aren't that many wonderful businesses.
He makes a really compelling point here, which is that if you really understand what you're investing in, it's going to be impossible to diversify too much. However, he does say that it's a perfectly good approach, diversification, for those that don't want to be a really big active investor. So really the summary here is from these great investors is that if you're a passive type of investor, diversify, there's nothing wrong with that. If you're an active investor, you can be more aggressive with certain names, especially if you're willing to put in the research and take on that risk. Tip number 8 is not really a tip, it's more of a guide or a resource matrix that I created here that you can reference if you're looking for a general guideline of what you should be looking at in your potential portfolio. This is very general, I must say that again as a disclaimer. and it's not gonna suit everyone's individual needs, but I think for most people watching this channel, it's gonna be a really rough guideline on what you should be looking for. So along the x-axis here, we have the risk tolerance. So conservative is going to be on the very left, and then aggressive is going to be on the very right. Along the y-axis, we have age, so young, and then older is at the bottom. I'm going to define young as anyone who has 35 to 40 years left until retirement age. Basically, you're the age of 35 or younger as of right now. I'm going to define older as anyone nearing retirement in the next 15 to 30 years, or even sooner than that. And if you are going to be retiring sooner than that, then take this entire matrix and just err more conservatively. So in the top right quadrant here, if you're young and aggressive, we can look at these potential holdings within your portfolio. You can go all ETFs. You can do a 90-10 split, so 90% stocks, 10% bonds, or you can go full ham mode and just go 100% ETF stocks. If you'd like, you could add some individual names or any combination of the above. You could also invest in different types of alternative assets like real estate, perhaps a small position in crypto, but I would not say you should have more than 5% of your total portfolio in crypto. So that's if you're young and aggressive. If you're young and conservative, you might look at target date funds. Those are pretty reasonable for most people. You can also go with an 80-20 split of stocks and bonds in your own portfolio, or a 70-30 split of stocks and bonds. These stocks and bonds could be ETFs, or they could be individual holdings if you want to be really active. You could look at things like the 3-fund portfolio, but ideally when you're young, you're just really focused on capital preservation if you're young and conservative, and you're really focused on increasing your income. Moving right along here, if you're older and aggressive, so the bottom right quadrant here, you're probably looking at a stock portfolio split of 60-40, so 60% stocks and then 40% bonds. And these can be ETFs as well, or you can go 50-50. And you can also add some individual names if you'd like, or even add some alternatives such as real estate. Lastly, if you're older and conservative and you're likely really close to retirement, say 15-20 years away, you're really focused on capital preservation at this point. You're not trying to lose money. So target date funds are still really good here for you. Obviously, hopefully you're still doing that. 50-50 stocks and bonds, 40-60 stocks to bonds. This could be even lower. It could be 30-70, it could be 20-80. Just basically don't lose money and do what you're comfortable with, especially when you're older and you're more on the conservative side. We're gonna go over 10 common investment decisions that are hurting your overall returns. If you're able to avoid these, you're gonna maximize your returns and also optimize for long-term wealth building. So let's get right into the number one item that is killing your returns, and that is buying individual stocks. Most people hear a stock pick from their friends or family, they hear it from the media, or they just wanna get into investing, so they invest with a brand that they are familiar with, like Nike or Coca-Cola. The problem is retail investors like you or I are horrible at picking stocks, and professional traders aren't that much better either. There was a famous academic paper that studied 19,646 day traders, and over the course of 300 days, it found that 97% of all investors actually lost money in the stock market. And in another day trading paper from UC Berkeley in 2011, it concluded that in an average year, over 360,000 individual investors day trade, but only about 15% of them were able to profit after accounting for trading costs. And famously, it's no secret that 95% of finance professionals can't beat the market either. Even with these statistics, people go to the stock market casino every single day and try to turn their money into a larger sum of money. There are stories of people on Wall Street bets turning 3K into 300K into a single month, and then the media likes to glorify these day traders that made a ton of money, for example, like back in the GameStop days in 2021. But for every single one of these traders that turns a once-in-a-lifetime profit, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other day traders who lose it all. For example, one Reddit poster turned $24,000 into $26, and another turned $97,000 into basically nothing over a single short year. There are probably many more that just don't post about it either, because the internet is not a place where you post your losers, you only post your winners. I think individual stocks definitely have a place in your portfolio. However, if you're just going all in on 1 to 3 different volatile stocks trying to turn $100 into $100,000, chances are you're not going to do very well. The more practical solution is just to buy a well-diversified mix of ETFs or index funds with a low expense ratio, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that brings me to my second investment decision today that could be costing you some returns, and that's actually not paying attention to an expense ratio. An expense ratio is the yearly fee that an ETF or index fund will charge you for investing in that fund. A typical index fund from Vanguard, for example, will charge you 0.05% per year. So on a $10,000 investment over the course of a single year, year, you pay about $5 in fees. However, there are some ETFs and mutual funds and index funds out there that charge you a lot more, upwards of 0.5% or even 1% or more. When the expense ratios are that high, they really start to eat into your returns. So a 1% fee on a $10,000 investment every year is about $100. And just to show you how that can really affect your overall balance, the SEC has this graph right here, and it says right here that in 20 years, a 1% annual fee will reduce your portfolio value by $30,000 compared to that of a portfolio with a 0.25% annual fee. So just a 0.75% difference in your expense ratio or your portfolio fees can make a really big difference. A popular ETF with a really high fee these days is the ARK line of ETFs. So the ARK Innovation ETF famously has a 0.75% expense ratio. Honestly, I think that's incredibly high. I think anything over 0.5% is incredibly high, especially if the returns don't really justify those fees. It's really not in your best interest to pay these high fees, and these fees just go to a fund manager, and these fund managers make a ton of money, and guess what? They don't beat the market. All right, moving into number 3 on our list today, and that is trying to time the market. When you're thinking of investing and you look at the stock market and it's close to an all-time high, you might want to wait a little bit before you start investing. But the truth is that nobody can really time the market, and if you just sit on the sidelines waiting for a dip, that dip might not actually ever happen. By April 1st, 2021, it closed over 4,000 for the first time, setting a new all-time high. Had you sat on the sidelines until now, you would have missed out on the run-up from 2021 to 2022, as well as the fact that the S&P 500 these days, it trades well over 5,000. Charles Schwab did a study from 2000 to 2020 and compared 5 different investing styles. One where it compared someone who had absolutely perfect timing every single time, and then 4 other investing styles. Surprisingly, even the person with horrible timing, as you can see with the results right here, they still made close to as much as 3 times as much as the person who just sat around in cash. So that's how much your inaction could be costing you right now. Basically, the opportunity cost of not investing is just too great. Obviously, the perfect timing person won out here, but really it's not by that much when you compare it to the person who invested immediately or dollar cost average. So yeah, don't try to time the market, but try to optimize your time in the market, and that's the old adage that definitely rings true. All right, something you should try to time though is how long it takes you to actually hit that subscribe button down below. I timed that it takes about 0.1 seconds, so if you can beat my time, please let me know.
He's a freak. He's a fast killer.
All right, I hope you pressed that button, and let's get into investment decision number 4 that could be costing you some returns, and that is hiring a professional financial advisor. But hear me out here. The caveat here is that financial advisors are really good for planning. So if you need estate planning, tax planning, or retirement planning, etc., they're your person. But when it comes to pure stock market returns, I would probably not go to a financial advisor if that's what I was looking for. When I used to be a financial advisor, investing was probably the easiest part of the job. All we did was put you in a standardized product that would probably match market returns. And honestly, we would just put you in ETFs that tried to match the S&P 500 ETF, if not a little bit better, but oftentimes, as you might know, it's hard to beat the market. And the shadier financial advisors, they would put you in mutual funds with high expense ratios or front-loaded fees where basically your fees would go towards the commissions of that advisor. I still think a financial advisor is a great person to have in your corner, especially if you need that planning type of help, but for investing alone, I don't think it's worth it. And oftentimes the fee structure for a financial advisor just doesn't make sense because they charge you generally a percentage of your assets under management. If you are gonna go with a financial advisor, make sure to look into the flat fee option. That way, no matter how much assets you have, they get paid the same. There are other options out there, such as financial advisors as a service, and many companies these days do this. Okay, the number 5 investing decision that could be killing your returns is emotional investing. If you invest based on emotion, you're basically giving in to your behavioral impulses, and oftentimes your behavioral impulses are not the correct calls. So there's something called the fear and greed index, which actually gauges market sentiment. It's based on the idea that when people are fearful, stocks often trade below what they're worth, and then vice versa, when people are very greedy, stocks trade for much more than what they're worth. Because so much of trading and investing can be psychological, oftentimes our impulses are the opposite of what we should be doing. This particular metric or index has been pretty accurate in the past. So for example, most famously during the COVID-19 pandemic, the index fell to an annual low of 2, which is extreme fear, when stocks plunged a ton during that week of lockdown. These days, the market sits in the greed category as investors are looking to capitalize on the run-up of the market as of late. Investing based on your emotion, either fear or greed, is the reason why people tend to buy at the very, very top and then sell at the very bottom. The best thing to do, in my opinion, is just to invest in a well-diversified basket of stocks and then set it and then just forget it. That brings me to point number 6 today, which is that when you are actually starting to invest and getting into investing, you shouldn't actually be optimizing for returns. Morgan Housel, the author of Psychology of Money, actually argues that you should optimize for endurance when it comes to investing. So let's actually take a listen to what he has to say.
I think it's extremely hard to beat the market, and very few people will do it. But I think there are really smart people who can do it, and people who I know who I could invest with. The reason I don't is not because I don't believe it can be done. It's because the variable that I want to maximize for in my investments is endurance. If I can just earn average returns for an above average period of time, it's going to lead to amount of success that will literally put you in the top 5% of investors.
And this is super true. As long as you stay invested over a long period of time and you get above average market returns, you're going to do way better than 95% of people out there. I also resonate with the idea that when it comes to endurance in investing, it may look like the fact that you might lose your password.
Your book taught me that successful investing is when you lose the password to your investment account.
Yes, that's exactly it.
I don't actually think you said that in there, but that's like, when I lose the password to my investment account, I'm so proud of myself.
Yeah.
Because it means I haven't checked it in forever.
So that's the host of the Diary of a CEO podcast. His name is Stephen Bartlett. And basically what he's saying here is that when you lose the investment account password that you have, you're just not checking your investments, which is a pretty good thing. That means you've actually set it and actually forgotten it. You're focused on the parts of life that matter more. Perhaps you're spending more time with your family, you're focused on making more money via your active income, and you're just experiencing life in general. This also plays into the idea of not emotionally investing, and it's definitely true. If you don't have the investment password, you can't make any trades, so therefore you are taking your emotions out of it. So I love that quote and podcast with Morgan Housel, and it really shows you how long-term minded you should be when it actually comes to investing. Mistake number 7 that could be killing your returns is not reinvesting dividends. So when a stock or fund that you own pays dividends, you can actually take it in cash, or you can decide to reinvest those dividends and purchase more shares of the underlying asset. If you don't need cash at that exact moment, I would definitely reinvest the dividends so that you can compound your future returns. So this is just basically a setting in your brokerage account. Whenever you get paid a dividend, it will automatically get reinvested into whatever underlying asset paid that dividend and just buys more fractional shares. There are many benefits to this. Most importantly, you are consistently accumulating the underlying fund or stock that you bought. Many companies will offer a dividend reinvestment plan, also known as a DRIP, and with these plans, there are usually no commissions or brokerage fees for the shares that you buy. You can sometimes get discounted prices, and they usually accrue in the form of fractional shares. So to actually do it is pretty easy. You just want to make sure that setting is toggled correctly in your brokerage account. So for example, I've pulled up my Fidelity account right here. You just want to make sure that it says reinvest in security. You can see that I've done it in all of my holdings right here. And if you actually click into AbbVie, you can see that for my holding of AbbVie Pharmaceutical that I have it selected here, and you can always update this in your brokerage account. All right, investment decision number 8 that could be costing you some returns is having a misaligned asset allocation for your age. Asset allocations can be very different for everybody. However, this talking point in particular is going to be quite general based on broad assumptions. So in investing, you just want to make sure that your asset allocation is actually tailored towards your goals and your risk tolerance. So if you're the age of 18, for example, and you're trying to build your wealth, then I wouldn't have my asset allocations in 100% bonds unless you're just completely risk averse. And vice versa, if you're about to retire at the age of 65, my asset allocation is probably not going to be just in 1 to 5 individual stocks. I'll link to my video down below on what your portfolio should look like by age if you want more information, but the summary is basically the following. When you're young, you want to be risky because you have much more time to make up for any risks that might not go your way. Then as you age, you want to shift your asset allocation towards more of a moderate approach. Perhaps you add some fixed income instruments like bonds. And then finally, right before you retire, you're probably going to be the most conservative. Fidelity did a study on asset allocations and their impact on long-term performance. And I think one interesting thing to note here is that the worst 20-year return annualized for any asset allocation is still positive. So that's a really good thing if you're questioning whether or not you should invest in the market, which is that for all rolling 20 20-year periods, it's always returned positively. All right, we touched upon this a little bit earlier in the video, but this is to expand on my point of individual stocks, which is investment mistake number 9 killing your returns is options trading. An option is a type of security that allows you to speculate on the price of a stock with a ton of leverage. For example, a call option gives you the right, but not the obligation to buy a stock at a certain price in the future for a pre-specified fee. So if you wanted to buy Apple stock for $150 per share in a month's time, you might be willing to pay a $15 fee for that right. The problem is though, is that if Apple stock is not trading for $150 plus the premium that you paid, the $15 fee, then you are technically underwater. Options are highly leveraged and there's a time decay factor, which makes them incredibly difficult to trade and make money on for the average investor. Oftentimes, options will make the stock market feel like a casino instead of a place where you can invest your money for long-term returns, and therein lies the problem. While it can multiply your potential gains by huge multiples, most people oftentimes will lose money on options trading. So here are some screenshots from my personal options trading journey. You can see that I got really lucky with options in GameStop of 2021, and I had earned $16,000 in profit in the month of January 2021. But then if you just look at my all-time history of options trades since, that you can see that most of these bars are in the red, which means most of the time I'm trading options, I'm losing money. So this summary page is actually a new feature from Robinhood where they show you your lifetime profit and loss, and this was really eye-opening for me. So all my gains that I made in options from 2021, these two big bars on the left here, were evaporated over the next few years. And even though this is my speculative stock market account because it is in Robinhood, you can see that I am clearly not a very good options investor. My stock market returns, on the other hand, since 2021 have been great because I'm mostly just invested in index funds as well as big companies like Apple, Meta, and Google. But clearly options trading is not for me. Actually, once I saw this lifetime P&L, I've decided to stop options trading altogether, and they're probably pretty horrible for the average investor as well. And that brings me to my last investment decision today that could be costing you a ton of returns, and that is not investing in index funds. Instead of playing options or trying to pick a moonshot stock, all you really have to do is invest in a low-cost, well-diversified index fund that tracks the market. Index funds like Vanguard's VFIAX or VTSAX, they track the largest 500 companies in the US, or they track the entire US stock market. So by buying that one fund, you're getting exposure to all of that fund and what it owns. Most index funds charge a really low fee, as I mentioned earlier in this video, and famously VTSAX, I think it charges about 0.06% or $6 for every $10,000 that you have invested. Index funds are really easy to buy in any brokerage, and if you can't buy the index fund, you can always opt for the ETF equivalent. In fact, Warren Buffett has been known to say that people are much better off buying a cross-section of America and forgetting about it when it comes to investing. So if you're in it for the long haul, make sure to try index fund investing. And with that said, you guys, thank you so much for watching this video.